Hello, everyone. For those who celebrate Merry Christmas Eve, I'm here in the McDowell living room, freshly painted on December 24th, and about as much holiday making as I have been able to do this season is to put on this red sweater. And this is kind of a difficult holiday for me. It's the first holiday without my dad, and I'm spending it alone. And I wanted to pick up this book. This week I finished All the Light You Cannot See, We Cannot See, which was quite a lovely book. I know it was a Netflix series, but and I haven't watched the series, but the book, I think it was from 2014, was, even though it was quite popular, was really wonderful. And I'm not good with stressful books. And it was during World War II, and there was like a tough part in the middle, and I had to put it down for a few days because I didn't know if I could keep going, because I hate stressful things, weirdly. But I picked it back up, and it was great. And one of the two main characters, a girl, she's like 15 and she's blind, and one of her prized possessions is this Jules Verne Braille book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And her great uncle has this secret room. It's during World War II, and they're doing secret radio transmissions. And she's in this situation where she's sort of locked up in this attic, and this German soldier is trying to figure out where this gem is hidden. And she's feeling like she's going to be captured, and she's still going on with this reading of this book. And ultimately, there's a young man who's the other lead character in the story, and he's German, but had been pulled into this military system of tracking the radar. And he had heard these broadcasts as a younger child growing up, and it was just amazing to him to be in this abandoned bunker, like trapped in rubble. And he had gotten the radio fixed, and he could hear her reading this book, and it brought back this flood of memories before the war. And as she was transmitting and doing this reading, like, she didn't know who she was transmitting it to. She just put it out into the waves, the radio waves, and it ended up reaching just the right person. And his colleague ended up throwing a grenade and breaking it open, because he knew that she was in danger, and he ran out and saved her in the attic. And it was quite a wonderful culmination of the book. And then it keeps going, and it's not the end of it is kind of sad. But so I thought you never know when you do read alouds where they go. And so I've been terribly neglectful about Momo, and I apologize, because it's quite a wonderful story. And I was just checking back on my playlist, and the last time I read it was the middle of August, after I'd gotten back from that not so successful visit in Seattle. And it's been a hard fall. Actually, shortly thereafter, my dad died. And it was a really hard day yesterday. Our family, we always had steaks. My dad always grilled us steaks on Christmas Eve. And so I went to the grocery store, and I got myself a big bone-in ribeye steak. But then I fell apart shortly thereafter. And I cried most of the night and had to go to bed early. So the steak is still sitting in the fridge, and I'll probably have it tomorrow. But I miss you, Dad, and maybe you'll hear me read this across. But I've been kind of outside of time since August, so maybe it's not really so long as I thought, and maybe I just needed to wait till I finished the other book to read this to you tonight. And so for those who weren't in for the much earlier readings, just to give you a little background, it's about an orphan girl who is very imaginative and very good at listening. And she lives in a little hidey hole in an amphitheater, probably somewhere in Greece or something like that. And she has two friends, a young guy who's a storyteller, and an old man who's a street sweeper. And they would have all the children come and gather in the theater, which is interesting given all of what we've been researching about sort of spectacle psychodrama. And but then one day these little gray men come into the town, and they're the time savings bankers, and they steal everyone's time, and they get all the grown-ups to be worried about time. And then everything in the town changes. It starts to change in really weird ways, and it seems so very relevant to what's happening, because I can't explain anything that's happened to me in the past couple years. It's been 2 years since I've talked to my kid, and that's really, really hard, and I can't explain it other than there's something going on in this world of frequency that's not right, that's gone haywire, and I think in some ways this book speaks to that. So eventually all the parents get preoccupied with time and saving time, and then the kids get affected, and then people stop coming to the theater. And then Momo figures out what's going on with these men. And so she and her friends organize a protest, and no one's supposed to really even see them. They're supposed to be invisible. So they show up and they arrive in your consciousness, and then they disappear. And so they don't know how they were caught up, but so then they start to target Momo. And after there was a big demonstration that ultimately didn't really pan out because none of the adults showed up. But there's this magical tortoise that it's quite interesting, actually, now that I think about it. Cassiopeia is the tortoise, and on the shell of the tortoise, letters show up, and they give her directions. And so before she's about to be captured, the tortoise, she just follows the tortoise, and he takes her to this secret place of time, and it's Professor Hora, Hora, of like hours, and so she escapes from the time-saving bankers in the gray men into this special room of time, and she learns about the lotuses, which are unfolding lives, the moments of our lives in time. So that's the end of the second section, and I'm just going to read that chapter again. And then I'm just going to read as long as I feel like reading tonight, because I have nothing better to do. And I appreciate that you guys are out there listening, and my family, if you're out there listening tonight or some other night, please know that I never stop loving you. I love you very much. And I wish you Merry Christmas. Chapter 12, The Nowhere House. Momo was standing in the biggest room she'd ever seen. It was bigger than the biggest cathedral or concert hall in the world. Massive columns supported a roof that could be sensed rather than seen in the gloom far above, and there were no windows anywhere. The golden light that wove its way across the immense hall came from countless candles, whose flames burned so steadily that they looked like daubs of brilliant paint, requiring no wax at all to keep them lit. The thousand-fold whirring and ticking and humming and chiming that Momo had heard on entering came from innumerable clocks of every shape and size. They were posed on long tables, in glass cabinets, on golden wall brackets, on endless rows of shelves. There were dainty, bejeweled pocket watches and cheap tin alarm clocks and hourglasses and musical clocks with pirouetting dolls on top. Sundials, clocks encased in wood and marble, glass clocks, and clocks driven by jets of water. On the walls hung all manner of cuckoo clocks and other clocks with weights and pendulums, some swinging slowly and majestically and others wagging busily to and fro. And all around the room, at first floor level, ran a gallery reached by a spiral staircase. Higher still was another gallery, and above it another, and above that yet another. And clocks were standing or hanging wherever Momo looked. Not only conventional clocks, but spherical timepieces showing what time it was anywhere in the world, and sidereal clocks, large and small, complete with sun, moon, and stars. Arrayed in the middle of the hall were countless bigger clocks, a forest of clocks, as it were, ranging from grandfather clocks to full-size church clocks. And not a moment passed, but one of these innumerable timepieces struck or chimed somewhere or other, for each of them showed a different time. And far from offending the ear, they combined to produce a sound as pleasant and harmonious as the rustle of leaves in a wood in springtime. Momo roamed from place to place, gazing wide-eyed at all these curiosities. She had paused beside a lavishly ornamented clock on which two tiny dancers, a man and a woman, were standing with hands entwined, and it was just about to prod them to see if they would move when she heard a friendly voice behind her. "Ah, so you're back, Cassiopeia," it said. "Did you bring Momo with you?" Turning, Momo looked at an avenue between the grandfather clocks and saw a frail old man with silvery hair stooping over the tortoise. He was wearing a gold embroidered frock coat, blue silk knee breeches, white hose and shoes with gold buckles, laced frothed from the cuffs and collar of his coat, and his silver hair was braided into a pigtail in the back. Momo had never seen such a costume before, though anyone less ignorant would at once have recognized it as the height of fashion 2 centuries earlier. "Well," said the old gentleman, still bending over the tortoise, "is she here? Where is she then?" He donned a small pair of eyeglasses like old Beppo's, except these were gold rimmed, and peered about him. "Here I am," called Momo. And the old gentleman came towards her with a beaming smile, both hands extended, and the nearer he drew, the younger he seemed to become. And by the time he had reached Momo's side, seized her hands and shaken them cordially, he looked little older than herself. "Welcome," he said delightedly. "Welcome to Nowhere House. Permit me to introduce myself, Momo. My name is Hora, Professor Secundus Minutus Hora." "Were you really expecting me?" Momo asked in surprise. "But of course! Why else would I have sent Cassiopeia to fetch you?" He produced a diamond-studded fob watch from his pocket and flipped the lid open. "In fact, you're uncommonly punctual," he said with a smile, holding out the watch for her inspection. There were no hands or numerals on the watch face, and Momo saw just two very fine superimposed spirals rotating slowly in opposite directions. Every now and then, the minute dots of light appeared where the spirals intersected. "This watch," said Professor Hora, "is known as a chrysomograph. It accurately records crises in the history of mankind, and one of these rare occurrences has just begun." "What's a crisis?" asked Momo. "Well, it's like this," the professor exclaimed. At certain junctures in the course of existence, unique moments occur when everyone and everything, even the most distant stars, combine to bring about something that could not have happened before and will never happen again. And few people know how to take advantage of these critical moments, unfortunately, and they often pass unnoticed. But when someone does recognize them, however, great things happen in the world. "Well, perhaps one needs a watch like yours to recognize them by," said Momo. Professor Horace smiled and shook his head. "No, my child, the watch by itself would be no use to anyone. You have to know how to read it as well." And he snapped the watch shut and replaced it in his pocket. And then, noticing Momo's ill-concealed surprise at his personal appearance, he looked down at himself and frowned. "Ah," he said, "you may be punctual, but I seem to be rather behind the times in fashion, I mean. How unobservant of me. I must put that right at once." And he clicked his fingers, and in a flash, his costume changed to a black frock coat, stovepipe trousers, and a stand-up collar. "Is that any better?" he inquired doubtfully. But Momo's look of astonishment was answer enough in itself. "No, of course not," he went on quickly. "What am I thinking of?" Another click of the fingers, and he instantly appeared in an outfit the like of which Momo had never seen, nor had anyone else, since it dated from 100 years in the future. "Still no good?" he asked. "Well, never mind. I'll get it right in the end." And he clicked his fingers a third time, and at long last he stood there attired in an ordinary suit of the kind men wear today. "That's more like it, eh?" Eyes twinkling. "I hope I didn't alarm you, Momo. It was just a little joke of mine. But now, my girl, come with me. You've a long journey behind you, and I'm sure you'd enjoy a hearty breakfast." And he took her by the hand and led her off to the clock forest, with the tortoise following at their heels. And after twisting and turning like a maze, the path eventually came out in a small room whose walls consisted of a gigantic grandfather clock. In one corner stood a bow-legged table, and beside it a dainty little sofa and some matching armchairs. And here, as elsewhere, everything was bathed in the golden glow of a myriad motionless candle flames. Set out on the table were a pot-bellied jug and 2 small cups, together with plates, spoons, and knives, all of a solid gleaming gold. There were also 2 little dishes, one containing golden yellow butter and the other honey, like liquid gold, and a basket piled high with crusty golden brown rolls. Professor Hora filled both cups with hot chocolate from the pot-bellied jug and made a gesture of invitation. There, little Momo, please tuck in. Momo needed no second bidding. Chocolate you could drink? Well, she'd never heard of that before. And as for rolls spread with butter and honey, they were a rare delicacy, and these rolls tasted more delicious than any she'd eaten in her life. Completely wrapped up in her wonderful breakfast, she feasted on it with her cheeks bulging and her mind devoid of every other thought. Although she hadn't slept a wink all night long, the food banished her weariness and made her feel fresh and lively. And the more she ate, the better it tasted. She felt as if she could have gone on eating like this for days on end. Professor Hora, who was watching her benevolently, was tactful enough not to cut short her enjoyment too soon by engaging in conversation. He realized his guest had years of hunger to make up for, and perhaps this was why, while watching her, he gradually looked older and older until he became a white-haired old gentleman again. And when he noticed that Momo wasn't too handy with a knife, he spread the rolls for her and put them on her plate. He himself ate little, just enough to keep her company. And at last, even Momo could eat no more, and she drank up her chocolate, studying her host over the rim of the golden cup and wondering who or what he could possibly be. I mean, he was no ordinary person, that much was obvious, but all she really knew about him was his name. She put her cup down and cleared her throat. Why did you send the tortoise to fetch me? Well, to protect you from the men in gray, Professor Hora replied gravely. They are searching for you everywhere, and you're only safe from them here with me. Momo looked startled. You mean they want to hurt me? Yes, my child, the professor sighed, in a manner of speaking. But why? Because they're afraid of you. Because no one could have done them greater harm. But I haven't done anything to them. Momo protested. Oh, yes, you have. You not only persuaded one of them to betray himself, you told your friends about him. And what's more, you and your friends tried to broadcast the truth about the men in gray. Isn't that enough to make you their mortal enemy? But we walk right through the city, the tortoise and I, Momo said. If they were searching for me everywhere, they could easily have caught us. We weren't going fast. And the tortoise had stationed himself at the professor's feet, and he took her on his lap and tickled her under the chin. Well, Cassiopeia, he said with a smile, what's your opinion? Could they have caught you? The word never appeared in lightning on Cassiopeia's shell, and the letters flickered so merrily that Momo thought she detected a dry little chuckle. The thing is, said the professor, Cassiopeia can see into the future. Not far, just half an hour or thereabouts, but still. Correction, flashed the shell. Pardon me, said the professor. I should have said half an hour precisely. She knows for certain what will happen in the next 30 minutes, like whether or not she's going to bump into the men in gray, for instance. My goodness, exclaimed Momo, how useful. So if she knew in advance she'd meet the men in gray at such and such a spot, would she simply take a different route? No, Professor Hora replied, I'm afraid it's not as easy as that. She can't undo anything she knows in advance because she knows what is actually going to happen. And if she knew she was going to meet the men in gray at a certain spot, well, she would meet them there. She would be powerless to prevent it. Momo's face fell. I don't understand, she said. In that case, there's no advantage in knowing anything in advance after all. Well, there is sometimes, said the professor. I mean, in your case, for example, she knew you were going to take a certain route and not meet any men in gray. And that was an advantage, wasn't it? Momo didn't reply. Her thoughts were as tangled as a skein of wool. But to return to you and your friends, the professor went on. I mean, I must congratulate you. Your posters and placards were most impressive. Let me make sure I didn't get that. No, that's right. Your posters and placards were most impressive. You mean you read them? Momo asked delightedly. Every last word, the professor assured her. Nobody else did from the look of it, said Momo. The professor nodded sympathetically. I'm afraid not. The men in gray saw to that. Do you know them well? Momo asked. He nodded again and sighed. As well as they know me. Momo didn't know what to make of this reply. Do you often go to see them? No, never. I've never set foot outside of this house. Well, what about the men in gray? Do they ever come over here? The professor smiled. Never fear, Momo. They can't get in. They couldn't even if they knew the way to Never Lane, which they don't. Momo thought a while. Though reassured by Professor Hoare's remarks, she was eager to learn more about him. Well, how do you come to know all this? She asked. I mean, about our posters and the men in gray. Well, I keep a constant watch on them and everything connected with them, the professor told her, and so I've naturally been watching you and your friends as well. Well, I thought you said you never left the house. Well, I've no need to, said the professor, rapidly growing younger again as he spoke, thanks to my omnivision glasses. And he took off the little gold spectacles and held them out. Would you care to try them? Well, we'll put them on. Well, I can't make out anything at all, she said, screwing up her eyes and blinking. All she could see was a whir of colors and lights and shadows. It made her feel positively dizzy. Yes, she heard the professor say, it's always the same to begin with. Seeing through omnivision glasses isn't as easy as all of that. You'll get soon used to them, though. He stood behind Momo's chair and gently adjusted the position of the frame, and at once everything sprang into focus. The first thing Momo saw was the men in gray and their 3 limousines on the edge of the district where the strange white buildings began. They were in the process of pushing their cars backwards. And then looking farther afield, she saw more gray figures in the city streets. They were talking and gesticulating excitedly as though passing on information of some kind. It's you they're talking about, Professor Hoare explained. They can't understand how you managed to escape. Well, why are they all so gray in the face? Momo asked, still watching them. Because they feed on dead matter, the professor told her. They live in people's time, as you know, but time dies. I mean, literally dies once it has been wrested away from its rightful owner. All human beings have their own share of time, but it survives only for as long as it really belongs to them. So the men in gray aren't human? No, their human appearance is only a disguise. Well, what are they then? Well, strictly speaking, they're nothing. Well, so where do they come from then? Well, they exist only because people give them the opportunity to do so. I mean, naturally, they seize that opportunity. And now that people are giving them a chance to rule their lives, they're naturally taking advantage of that too. Well, what would happen if they couldn't steal any more time? Well, they disappear into thin air, which is where they come from. Professor Hoare took his glasses back and pocketed them. Unfortunately, he continued after a pause, they already have plenty of human accomplices. That's the worst part. Well, nobody's going to steal any of my time, Momo said stoutly. Well, I should hope not, said the professor. From one moment to the next, he looked like an old man again. Come along, Momo, I want to show you my collection. And taking her by the hand, he led her back into the great hall, where he showed her all sorts of timepieces and made them chime for her. He explained the workings of his sidereal clocks, and gradually, under the influence of his little visitor's obvious delight in all of these marvels, he grew younger again. Tell me, he said as they walked on, do you like riddles? Oh, yes, very much, Momo said eagerly. Do you know any? Yes, said Professor Hoare, smiling at her. I know a real teaser. Very few people can solve it. All the better, Momo said. I'll make a special note of it so I can try it out on my friends. The professor's smile broadened. I can't wait to see if you can solve it. Okay, listen carefully. All dwelling in one house are strange brothers 3, as unlike as any 3 brothers could be. Yet try as you may to tell one brother from brother, you'll find that the trio resemble each other. The first isn't there, Though he'll come beyond doubt. The second's departed, so he's not about. The third and the smallest is right on the spot, and manage without him the others could not. And yet the third is a factor with which to be reckoned, because the first brother turns into the second. You cannot stand back and observe number 3, for one of the others is all you will see. So tell me, my child, are the 3 of them one, or are there but 2, or could there be none? Just name them, and you will at once realize that each rules a kingdom of infinite size. They rule it together and are it as well. In that they're alike. So where do they dwell? Professor Hora gave Momo an encouraging nod, and thanks to her excellent memory, she was able to repeat the whole rhyme word for word. And she did so slowly and carefully, and then sighed. Whew, she says, that's a really hard one. I have no idea what the answer could be. I don't even know where to start. Just try, said the professor. Momo recited the riddle again under her breath, and finally she shook her head. It's no use, she said. The tortoise, which had now rejoined them and was seated at the professor's feet, had been watching Momo intently. Well, Cassiopeia, said the professor, you know everything half an hour in advance. Will Momo solve the riddle or won't she? Cassiopeia's shell lit up. She will, it spelled out. You see, the professor said, running to Momo, you are going to solve it. Cassiopeia has never been wrong yet. Momo knit her brow and racked her brains once more. Who were these 3 brothers that all lived in the same house? They obviously weren't brothers in the usual sense. In riddles, brothers always meant like grains of sand or teeth or things like similar things at all events. But these 3 things somehow turned into each other. So what sort of things could do that? Now, looking around in search of inspiration, Momo caught the sight of the candles with their motionless flames. Fire turned wax into light. Yes, they were 3 brothers, but that couldn't be the answer because they were all there at the same time, and 2 of them weren't supposed to be. Well, what about blossom, fruit, and seed? Could that be the answer? Could that be something of that kind? The more Momo debated this possibility, the more promising it seemed. So the seed was the smallest of the 3, and it was there when the other 2 weren't, and then the other 2 couldn't exist without it. But no, that wouldn't do either, because a seed was perfectly visible, and the riddle said that anyone looking at the smallest of the 3 brothers always saw one of the other 2. Momo's thoughts flitted hither and thither, and she simply couldn't find a clue that led anywhere. But still, Cassiopeia had predicted she would solve the riddle, so slowly she recited it to herself for a 3rd time. And when she came to the line, the first isn't there, though he'll come beyond doubt, she saw Cassiopeia give her a wink, and the words, what I know, lit up on her shell, but only for a split second. Professor Horace smiled. No helping, Cassiopeia, he said, though he hadn't been looking in her direction. Momo can work it out all by herself. Momo, who had seen the words, began to ponder their meaning. So what was it that Cassiopeia knew? Well, she knew the riddle would be solved, but that was no help. So what else did Cassiopeia know? Well, she always knew what was going to happen. So she knew the future, cried Momo. The first isn't there, though he'll come beyond doubt. That's the future. Professor Hora nodded. And the second's departed, Momo went on, so he's not about, and that must be the past. And the professor beamed at her and nodded again. And now comes the hard part, Momo said thoughtfully. What can the 3rd brother be? He is the smallest of the 3, but the other 2 can't manage without him, and he's the only one at home. After another pause for thought, she gave a sudden exclamation. Of course, it's now. It's this very moment. The past consists of moments gone by and the future of moments to come, so neither of them could exist without the present. That's it. Her cheeks were glowing with excitement now, but what does the next bit mean? Yet the 3rd is a factor with which to be reckoned because the first brother turns into the second. Now, I suppose that means the present exists only because the future turns into the past? She looked at Professor Hora with dawning amazement. Yes, it's true. I'd never looked at it like that before. If it is true, though, there's really no such thing as the present, only the past and the future. Like, take this moment, for instance. By the time I talk about it, it's already past. And you cannot stand back and observe number three, for one of the others is all you will see. So I understand what you mean now. I mean, I understand the rest too, because you could be forgiven for thinking there was only one brother, the present. I mean, or only the past or the future, or none of them at all, because each of them exists only when the others do. Golly, it's enough to make your head spin. But the riddle isn't finished yet, said the professor. What this kingdom, the brothers all rule together, the one they themselves are. And Momo looked baffled. What could it be? What did past, present, and future amount to, all lumped together? And she gazed around the great hall with its thousands upon thousands of clocks, and suddenly her face lit up. Time. Time, she cried, clapping her hands and skipping for joy. That's what it is. It's time. And the house the brothers live in, what would it be? The world, I suppose, Momo replied. Bravo, said the professor, clapping in turn. I congratulate my girl. You're doing a really good job at solving riddles. I am delighted. Me too, said Momo, secretly wondering why he should be quite so pleased that she had solved his riddle. He showed her many other rare and interesting things as they resumed their tour of the clock-filled hall, but the riddle continued to occupy her thoughts. Tell me, she said eventually, what exactly is time? Well, you've just found that out for yourself, the professor replied. No, she said, I mean, time itself. I mean, it exists, so it must be something, but what is it really? The professor smiled. Well, it would be nice if you worked out your own answer to that question, too. And Momo pondered for a long time. It exists, she mused. That much I do know, but you can't touch it or hold it. Could it be something like a perfume? I mean, then again, it's always passing by, so it must come from somewhere. I mean, perhaps it's like the wind? No, wait. Well, perhaps it's a kind of music you just don't hear because it's always there. She paused and then added, though I have heard it sometimes, I think, very faintly. The professor nodded. I know. That's why I was able to summon you here. But there must be more to it than that, said Momo, still pursuing her train of thought. I mean, the music comes from far off, but I seem to hear it deep inside me. Perhaps time works that way too. She broke off, bewildered. I mean, she said, like the wind making waves in the sea. She shrugged and shook her head. I expect I'm talking nonsense. Not at all, said the professor. I think you put it very prettily indeed, and that's why I'm going to let you into a secret. If you want to know, all the time in the world comes from here, from Nowhere House and Never Lane. Momo gazed at him in awe. I see, she said softly. You mean you make it yourself? The professor smiled again. No, my child, I'm merely its custodian. All human beings have their allotted span of time. My task is to see that it reaches them. In that case, said Momo, why not simply arrange things so that they don't have any more of it stolen by the time thieves? I can't, the professor told her. What people do with their time is their own business. They must guard it themselves. I can only distribute it. And Momo looked around the great hall. Is that why you keep all these clocks? One for every person in the world? No, Momo, these clocks are just a hobby of mine. They are very imperfect copies of something that everyone carries inside them. Just as people have eyes to see light and ears to hear sound, so they have hearts for an appreciation of time. And all the time they fail to appreciate is wasted on them, as the colors of the rainbow are wasted on a blind person or a nightingale's song on a deaf one. Some hearts are unappreciative of time, I fear, though they beat like all the rest. What will happen when my heart stops beating? Momo asked. When that moment comes, said the professor, time will stop for you as well. Or rather, you will retrace your steps through time, through all the days and nights and months and years of your life until you go out through the great round silver gate you entered by. And what will I find on the other side? The home of the music you've sometimes faintly heard in the distance. But by then, you'll be part of it. You yourself will be a note in its mighty harmonies. Professor Hora looked at Momo searchingly. But I don't suppose that makes much sense to you, does it? Yes, said Momo, I think so. And then recalling her strange progress along Never Lane and the way she lived through everything in reverse, she asked, Are you death? The professor smiled. If people knew the nature of death, he said, after a moment's silence, they would cease to be afraid of it. And if they ceased to be afraid of it, no one could rob them of the time anymore. Why not tell them then? Momo suggested. I already do, said the professor. I tell them the meaning of death with every hour I send them. But they refuse to listen. They would sooner heed those who frighten them, and that's another riddle in itself. I'm not frightened, said Momo. Professor Hora nodded slowly, and he gave her another searching stare. And then he said, Would you like to see where time comes from? Yes, she whispered. I'll take you there, said the professor, but only if you promise not to ask questions. Is that understood? Momo nodded. Professor Horace stooped and picked her up, and all at once he seemed immensely tall and inexpressibly old, but not as a man grows old, more in the manner of an ancient tree or a primeval crag. Clasping Momo with one arm, he covered her eyes with his other hand so gently that it felt as if snowflakes were landing on her cheeks, like icy thistledown. Momo sensed that he was striding down a long, dark tunnel, but she felt quite safe and utterly unafraid. At first she thought she could hear her own heartbeats, but then she became more and more convinced that they were really the echoes of her professor's footsteps. And after what seemed like a very long way, he put Momo down. His face was close to hers, and when he removed his hand from her eyes, he gave her a meaningful look and put a finger to his lips. And then he straightened up and stepped back. And everything was bathed in a sort of golden twilight. And when his eyes became accustomed to it, Momo saw that she was standing beneath a mighty dome as big as the vault of heaven itself. Or so it seemed to her. And that the whole of this dome was made of the purest gold. High overhead, in the very center of the dome, was a circular opening through which a shaft of light fell straight onto an equally circular lake whose dark, smooth waters resembled a jet black mirror. Just above the surface, glittering in the shaft of light with the brilliance of a star, something was slowly and majestically moving back and forth. Momo saw that it was a gigantic pendulum, but one with no visible means of support. Apparently weightless, it soared and swooped above the mirror-smooth water with a bird-like ease. And as the glittering pendulum slowly neared the edge of the lake, an enormous water lily bud emerged from its dark depths. And the closer the pendulum came, the wider it opened, until at last it lay full-blown on the surface. Momo had never seen so exquisite a flower. It was such as Momo had never dreamed of. And while the pendulum hovered above it, she became so absorbed in the spectacle that she forgot everything else. The scent alone seemed something that she had always craved without knowing what it was. But then, very slowly, this pendulum swung back, and as it did so, Momo saw to her dismay that the glorious flower was beginning to wilt, and petal after petal dropped off and sank into the blackness below. And to Momo, it was as if something utterly dear to her was vanishing beyond recall. And by the time the pendulum reached the center of the lake, the flower had completely disintegrated. And at that moment, however, a new bud arose near the opposite shore. And as the pendulum drew nearer, Momo saw that an even lovelier blossom was beginning to unfold. And she walked around the lake to inspect it more closely. This new flower was altogether different from its predecessor. Momo had never seen such colors before, but these colors seemed richer and more exquisite by far. And the petals too gave off a different and a far more delicious scent. And the longer Momo studied them, and the more marvelous in every detail she found them. But again, the glittering pendulum swung back, and as it did, glorious blossom withered and sank, petal by petal, into the dark and unfathomable depths of the lake. And slowly, very slowly, the pendulum proceeded on its way, but not to exactly the same place as before. This time it checked its swing a little way farther along the shore, and there, one pace from where it had previously paused, another bud arose and unfolded. And to Momo, this seemed the loveliest lily of all, the flower of flowers, a positive miracle. She could have wept aloud when this perfect blossom too began to fade and subside into the depths. But she remembered her promise to Professor Hora and uttered no sound. And meanwhile, the pendulum had returned to the opposite shore, another pace farther along, and a fresh bud broke the glassy surface. And as time went by, it dawned on Momo that each new blossom differed entirely from those that had gone before, and that it always seemed the most beautiful of all. She wandered around the lake, watching flower after flower unfold and die. And although she felt she could never tire of this spectacle, she gradually became aware of another marvel, one that had escaped her until now. She could not only see the shaft of light that streamed down from the center of the dome, she could hear it as well. And at first it reminded her of the wind whistling in a distant treetop. But the sound swelled until it resembled the roar of a waterfall, the thunder of waves breaking on a rocky shore. And more clearly, Momo perceived that this mighty sound consisted of innumerable notes, whose constant changes of pitch were forever weaving different harmonies. It was music, and yet it was also something else. All at once she recognized it as the faraway music she had sometimes faintly heard while listening to the silence of a starry night. But now, as the sound became ever clearer and more glorious, she sensed that it was the resonant shaft of light that summoned each bud from the dark depths of the lake and fashioned it into the flower of unique and inimitable beauty. And the longer she listened, the more clearly she could make out the individual voices. Not human voices, but notes, such as they might have been given forth by gold and silver and every precious metal in existence. And then beyond them, as if there were voices of quite another kind, made themselves heard, infinitely remote, yet indescribably powerful. And as they gained strength, Momo began to distinguish words uttered in a language she had never heard before, but could nevertheless understand. The sun and moon and planets and stars were telling her their own true names. and their names signified what they did and how they all combined to make each our lily flower and fade in turn. And suddenly Momo realized that all of these words were directed at her. And from where she stood to the most distant star in space, the entire universe was focused upon her, like a single face of unimaginable size looking at her and talking to her. And what overcame her was something more than fear. A moment later, she caught sight of Professor Hora silently beckoning to her, and she ran to him and buried her face in his chest. Taking her in his arms, he put one hand over her eyes. As before, light as thistledown, and carried her back along the endless tunnel. Again, all seemed dark, but again she felt snug and secure. Once they were back in the little clock-lined room, he laid her down on the sofa. Professor Hora, Momo whispered, I never knew that everyone's time was so. She strove to find the right word, but in vain. So big, she said eventually. What you've just seen and heard wasn't everyone's time, the professor replied. It was only your own. There's a place like the one you visited in every living soul. But only those who let me take them there can reach it, nor can it be seen with ordinary eyes. So where was I? In the depths of your own heart, said the professor, gently stroking her tousled hair. Professor Hora, she whispered again, may I bring my friends to see you too? No, he said, not yet. That isn't possible. Until you feel it's time to rejoin your friends, my child. But may I tell them that the stars were saying, you may, but you won't be able to. Why not? Because before you can, the words must take root inside of you. But I want to tell them, all of them. I want to sing them what the voice is saying, and then everything would come right again, I think. If that's what you really want, Momo, you must learn to wait. I don't mind waiting. I mean, wait like a seed that must slumber in the earth before it can sprout. That's how long the words will take to grow up inside of you. Is that what you want? Yes. Yes, she whispered. Then sleep, said Professor Hora, gently passing his hand across her eyes. Sleep. And Momo heaved a deep, consented sigh and fell asleep. Part 3, the Hour Lilies. Chapter 13, a year and a day. Momo awoke and opened her eyes. It was a while before she gathered where she was, and to her bewilderment, she found herself back on the grass-grown steps of the amphitheater. If she'd been with Professor Ora in Nowhere House only moments before, how had she made her way back here so quickly? It was cold and dark, with the first light of dawn just showing above the eastern skyline. Momo shivered and burrowed deeper into her baggy jacket. She had a vivid recollection of all that had happened, of trudging through the city behind the tortoise, of the district with the strange glow and the dazzling white houses, of Never Lane and the great hall filled with clocks of hot chocolate and rolls and honey, and of her conversation with Professor Hora. She could even recall the riddle word for word. Above all, though, she recalled what she had witnessed beneath the golden dome. She had only to shut her eyes to see the hour lilies in all their undreamed of splendor. And as for the voices of the sun, moon, and stars, they still rang in her ears so clearly that she could hum the melodies they sang. And while she did so, words took shape within her, words that truly described the scent of the flowers and the colors she had never seen before. It was the voices in her memory that spoke them, and yet the memory itself brought something wonderful in its train. Momo found that she could recall not only what she had seen and heard, but much, much more besides. Hour lilies by the thousand blossomed in her mind's eye, welling up as if from some magical, inexhaustible spring. New words rang out as each new flower appeared, and Momo had only to listen closely and she could repeat the words, even sing them. They told of strange and wonderful things, but their meaning eluded her as soon as she uttered them. So that was what Professor Hora had meant when he said that the words must first take root within her. Or had everything been a dream after all? I mean, had none of it really happened? Momo was still pondering this question when she caught sight of something crawling across the arena below her. It was a tortoise engaged in a leisurely quest for edible plants. Momo ran quickly down the steps and knelt on the ground beside it. The tortoise looked up for a moment, regarded her briefly with its large, dark, age-old eyes, and calmly went on eating. "Good morning, tortoise," said Momo. The creature's shell remained blank. "Was it you that took me to see Professor Hora last night?" Still no answer. Momo heaved a sigh of disappointment. "What a pity," she muttered. "So you're only an ordinary tortoise after all, and not... Oh, I've forgotten what she was called. It was a pretty name, but long and foreign sounding. I thought I'd never heard it before." Some faintly luminous letters showed up on the tortoise's shell. Cassiopeia, they read. And Momo joyfully spelled them out. "Yes," she cried, clapping her hands. "That was it. So it was you. You are Professor Hora's tortoise, aren't you?" "Who else?" "Well, why didn't you say so right away then?" "Having breakfast?" "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Momo. "I didn't mean to disturb you. All I'd like to know is, why am I back here?" "By choice." Momo scratched her head. "That's funny. I don't remember wanting to leave. How about you, Cassiopeia? Why did you come too instead of staying with the professor?" "By choice," Cassiopeia repeated. "Thank you," said Momo. "That was nice of you." "Not at all." And that seemed to conclude the conversation as far as Cassiopeia was concerned, because she plodded off to resume her interrupted breakfast. Momo sat down on the steps, impatient to see Beppo, Guido, and the children again. The music continued to ring out inside of her, and although she was all alone with no one around to hear, she joined in the words and melodies more and more loudly and lustily. And as she sang straight into the rising sun, it seemed to her that the birds and the crickets and the trees and even the amphitheater's time-worn stones were listening to her. Little did she know that they would be her only listeners for a long time to come. Little did she know that she was waiting in vain for her friends to appear, that she had been gone a whole year, and that everything had changed in the meantime. The men in gray disposed of Guido with relative ease. It had all begun about a year ago, only days after Momo's sudden and mysterious disappearance, when a leading newspaper printed an article about him, headlined, "The Last of the Old-Time Storytellers." It mentioned where and when and where he could be found, and described him as an attraction not to be missed. And from then on, the amphitheater was besieged by growing numbers of people anxious to see and hear him. Well, this, of course, was all right with Guido, and he continued to say the first thing that came into his head and ended by handing around his cap, which always came back brimming with coins and banknotes. Before long, he was employed by a travel agent who paid him additional fees for permission to present him as a tourist attraction in his own right. Busloads of sightseers rolled up in such numbers that Guido was soon obliged to keep a strict timetable so that all who had paid to hear him got a chance to do so. He began to miss Momo more and more because his stories had lost their inspiration. But he steadfastly refused to tell the same story twice, even when offered twice his usual fee. But after a few months, Guido could no longer needed to turn up at the amphitheater and hand around his battered peaked cap. Having been, quote unquote, discovered first by a radio station and then by a television, he was soon earning a mint of money by telling his stories 3 times weekly to an audience of millions. By now, he had given up his lodgings near the amphitheater and moved to quite another part of town, where all the rich and famous people lived. And he rented a big modern villa set in a well-kept grounds and dropped the nickname Guido and called himself Girolamo instead. Girolamo. Guido was far too pressed for time, of course, to go on inventing new stories as he used to, so he began to ration his material with care, sometimes concocting as many as 5 stories out of one. And when even that failed to meet the ever-increasing demand for his services, he did something he should never have done. He broadcast a story destined for Momo's ears alone. It was lapped up as greedily and forgotten as speedily as all the rest, and the public clamored for more. And Guido was so bemused by the sheer pace of everything that without stopping to think, he reeled off all of Momo's treasured stories in quick succession. And when the last of them was told, he felt drained and empty and incapable of making up any more. Terrified that success might desert him, he started to tell his stories all over again, making only minor changes using different names for his characters. Extraordinarily enough, nobody seemed to notice. At all events, it didn't affect his popularity. Guido clung to this thought like a drowning man clutching at a straw. He was rich and famous now, he told himself, and wasn't that what he'd always dreamed of? Sometimes, though, while lying awake at night between silk sheets, he yearned for his old way of life, for the happy times he'd spent with Momo and Beppo and the children when he was still a genuine storyteller. But there was no way back, for Momo had never reappeared, and Guido had made strenuous efforts to find her at first, but he no longer had the time. He was now employed 3 super efficient secretaries to negotiate contracts for him and take down his stories in shorthand, handle his publicity, and keep his engagement diary. And somehow his schedule never left him time to resume the search for Momo. One day, when little of the old Guido remained, he pulled out what was left of himself together and resolved to turn over a new leaf. He was a somebody now, he told himself. He carried a lot of weight with millions of listeners and viewers. Who was better placed than he to tell the truth? He would tell them about the men in gray, emphasize that the story was a true one, and ask all his fans to help him look for Momo. He formed this intention late one night when he had been pining for his old friends. By daybreak, he was at his massive desk preparing to put his ideas down on paper, and even before he had written a word, however, the telephone rang. He picked up the receiver, listened, and went rigid with terror. At the sound of the peculiarly flat, expressionless voice in his ear, he felt as if the very marrow of his bones had turned to ice. "Drop the idea," the voice said. "We advise you to, for your own sake." "Who's speaking?" Guido demanded. "You know very well," the voice replied. "We've no need to introduce ourselves. You haven't had the pleasure of making our acquaintance. But we've owned you body and soul for a long time now. Don't pretend you don't know. What do you want? This latest scheme of yours doesn't appeal to us. Be a good boy and drop it, will you?" Guido took his courage in both hands. No, he said, I won't. I'm not poor little Guido guide any longer. I'm a celebrity. Try taking me on and see how far you get. The voice gave such a gray, mirthless laugh that Guido's teeth began to chatter. You're a nobody, it said. A rubber doll. We've blown you up, but give us any trouble and we'll let the air out. Do you seriously think you owe what you are today to yourself and your own unremarkable talents? Yes, Guido said hoarsely. That's just what I do think. Poor old Guido, said the voice. You're still as much of a dreamer as you ever were. You used to be Prince Girolamo, disguised as a nobody called Guido. And what are you now? Just a nobody called Guido, disguised as Prince Girolamo. You should be grateful to us. After all, we're the ones that made your dreams come true. That's a lie, Guido shouted. Heavens, said the voice with another merciless laugh. You're hardly the person to bandy words with us on the subject of truth and falsehood. Oh no, my poor Guido. You'll regret it if you try quoting the truth at people. Thanks to us, you've become famous for your tall stories. You aren't qualified to tell the truth, so forget it. What have you done with Momo? Guido asked in a whisper. Don't you worry your poor little scatterbrained head about that. You can't help her anymore. Least of all by telling stories about us. If you do, you'll only destroy your success as quickly as it came. It's up to you, of course. If you're really set on playing the hero and ruining yourself, we won't stop you. But you can't expect us to reward your ingratitude by continuing to protect your interests. Don't you like being rich and famous? Yes, Guido replied in a muffled voice. Exactly. So leave us out of it. Go on telling people what they want to hear. Now that I know the truth, Guido said with an effort, how can I? I'll give you some sound advice. Don't take yourself so seriously. The matter's out of your hands. Look at it from that angle, and you'll find you can carry on very nicely as before. Yes, Guido muttered, staring into space. From that angle. The earpiece gave a click and went dead. Guido hung up too. He slumped forward onto the desktop and buried his face in his arms, racked with silent sobs. And from then on, Guido lost every scrap of self-respect. He abandoned his plan and carried on as before, though he felt an utter fraud. And so he was. Once upon a time, his imagination had soared along and he had blithely followed its lead, but now he was telling lies. He was making a buffoon of himself, a public laughingstock, and he knew it. He hated his work, and the more he hated it, the sillier and more sentimental his stories became. This didn't impair his reputation, though, and on the contrary, the public acclaimed him for pioneering a new style of humor, and many comedians tried to imitate it. Guido was all the rage now that not that he derived any pleasure from it. He now knew who was responsible for his success. He had gained nothing and lost everything. And still he continued to race by car or plane from one engagement to the next, accompanied everywhere by the secretaries to whom he never stopped dictating old stories in new guises. Amazingly inventive was the newspaper's pet description of him. Guido the dreamer had, in fact, become Girolamo the hoaxer. Beppo Road Sweeper presented the men in gray with a far harder nut to crack. Ever since the night of Momo's disappearance, and whenever his work permitted, he had gone to the amphitheater and sat there waiting. At last, when his mounting concern and anxiety became too much to bear, he resolved to override Guido's objections, reasonable though they were, and go to the police. What if they do put her back in one of those homes with the bars over the windows, he reflected. Well, better that than being held prisoner by the men in gray, if she's still alive, of course. She escaped from a children's home once, so she could do it again, and besides, maybe I could fix it so they didn't put her in a home at all. The first thing to do is find her. And so he made his way to the nearest police station, which was on the outskirts of the city, and once there, he hung around outside for a while, twisting his hat in his hands. And then he plucked up the courage and walked in. Yes? Said the desk sergeant, who was busy filling out a long and complicated form. Beppo took some time to get it out. Well, the thing is, he said at last, something really dreadful must have happened. Really? Said the desk sergeant, still writing. What's it all about? It is about our Momo. A child? Yes, a girl. Is she yours? No, yes, but I'm not her father. No, yes, snapped the desk sergeant. Whose child is she then? Who are her parents? Nobody knows, said Beppo. Where is she registered then? Registered? Said Beppo. Well, with us, I suppose. I don't know. We all know her. Oh, so she isn't registered, the desk sergeant said with a sigh. That's against the law, in case you didn't know. Who does she live with then? Well, she lives by herself, Beppo replied. That's to say, she used to live in the old amphitheater, but she doesn't anymore. She's just gone. Just a minute, said the desk sergeant. Now, if I understand you correctly, the ruins have until recently been occupied by a young female vagrant named, what'd you say her name was? Momo, said Beppo. The policeman pulled a pad towards him and started writing. Momo, he repeated. Okay, well, go on. Momo what? I'll need her full name. Well, Momo nothing, Beppo said, just Momo. The desk sergeant stroked his chin and looked aggrieved. See here, old-timer, you'll have to do better than this. I'm trying to be helpful, but I can't file a report without your cooperation, so you better begin by telling me your own name. Beppo, said Beppo. Beppo what? Beppo Road Sweeper. Your name, I said, not your occupation. Well, it's both, Beppo explained patiently. The desk sergeant put his pen and buried his face in his hands. God give me strength, he muttered despairingly. Why did I have to be on duty now, of all times? And then he straightened up, squared his shoulders, and gave the old man an encouraging smile. All right, he said gently, as though humoring a small child. I can take your personal particulars later. Just tell me the whole story from start to finish. Beppo looked dubious. All of it? Anything that's relevant, said the desk sergeant. I'm up to my eyes in work. I've got this whole stack of forms to complete by lunchtime, and I'm about to end my tether. But never mind that. Just take your time and tell me what's on your mind. He sat back and closed his eyes with an air of martyr at the stake. And Beppo, in his queer roundabout way, recounted the whole story from Momo's arrival on the scene and her exceptional gifts to the trial on the garbage dump, which he himself had witnessed. And that very same night, he concluded, Momo disappeared. The desk sergeant subjected him to a long, resentful glare. I see, he said. So you're telling me that an unlikely sounding girl whose existence remains to be proved may have been kidnapped and carried off, and you can't say where to, by the ghosts of some kind. Is that what you expect me to investigate? Yes, please, Beppo said eagerly. The desk sergeant leaned forward. Breathe on me, he barked. And although Beppo failed to see the point of this request, he shrugged his shoulders and obediently blew on the policeman's face. The desk sergeant sniffed and shook his head. Well, you don't appear to be drunk. No, mumbled Beppo, puce in the face with embarrassment. I've never been drunk in my life. Then why tell me such a cock and bull story? Did you really think I'd be daft enough to believe it? Yes, Beppo replied innocently. And at that, the policeman's patience finally snapped. He jumped up and slammed his fist down hard on the stack of long and complicated forms. That does it, he bellowed, beside himself with rage. Get out of here or I'll lock you up for insulting behavior. Beppo looked dismayed. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I didn't mean it that way. All I meant was, out, roared the desk sergeant, and Beppo turned and went. And during the next few days, he called at various other police stations with much the same result. He was kicked out, politely sent home, or humored as the best means of getting rid of him. One day, however, he was interviewed by a police inspector with less sense of humor than his colleagues. And after listening to Beppo's story without a flicker of expression, he turned to a subordinate and said coldly, That man is off his rocker. We'll have to find out if he is a threat to society. Take him down to the cells. Beppo had to spend half the day in a cell before being whisked off in a car by 2 policemen. They drove him all the way across the city to a big white building with bars over the windows. It wasn't a prison or detention center as he first thought, but a hospital for nervous disorders. And here Beppo underwent a thorough examination. The hospital staff treated him kindly. They didn't laugh at him or bawl him out. In fact, they seemed very interested in his story because they made him tell it over and over again. Although they never questioned it, Beppo got the feeling that they didn't really believe it. Whatever they made of him, which was far from clear to Beppo himself, they didn't discharge him. Whenever he asked how soon he could go, he was told, soon, but you're needed here for the time being. We haven't completed our investigations, but we're making progress. And Beppo, who thought that they were referring to investigations into Momo's whereabouts, continued to wait patiently. They had allotted him a bed in a big ward where many other patients slept, and one night he woke up and saw by the feeble glow of the emergency lighting that someone was standing beside his bed. All he could tell at first was that the shadowy figure was smoking a cigar or a cigarette. The tip glowed red in the gloom. But then he realized the bowler and the briefcase, and realizing that his visitor was one of the men in gray, he felt chilled to the marrow and opened his mouth to call for help. Quiet, hissed an ashen face. I've been authorized to make you a proposition. Listen to it carefully and don't answer till I tell you. You now have some idea of the power we already wield, and whether or not you get another taste of it is entirely up to you. Although you can't harm us in the least by retelling your story to go to all and sundry, it doesn't suit our scheme of things. You are quite correct in assuming that your friend Momo is our prisoner, but you may as well abandon all hope of finding her. That you will never do, and all your efforts to rescue her aren't making the poor girl's position any easier. Every time you try, she has to suffer for it. So be more careful what you do and say from now on. The man in gray blew several smoke rings, gleefully observing the effect of his speech on Beppo. It was clear that the old man believed every word of it. My time is valuable, the man in gray went on. So here's our proposition in a nutshell. You can have the girl back, but only on condition that you never utter another word about us or activities. As ransom, so to speak, we shall additionally require you to deposit 100,000 hours of your time with us. And how we bank it is our affair and doesn't concern you. And all you have to do is save it. Now, how you save it is your affair. If you agree, we'll arrange for you to be released in the next few days. And if not, you'll stay here for as long as Momo remains with us. In other words, forevermore. It is a generous offer, so think it over. You won't get a second chance. Well, Beppo swallowed hard a couple times, and then he croaked, I agree. Very sensible of you, the man in gray said smugly. So remember, absolute discretion and 100,000 hours of your time. And as soon as you've saved them for us, you can have Momo back. And now, my dear sir, goodbye. And on that note, the man in gray departed, leaving a trail of cigar smoke behind him. It seemed to glow faintly in the darkness like a will-o-wisp. Beppo stopped telling his story from that night on, and when asked why he told it in the first place, would merely look sad and shrug his shoulders. The hospital authorities discharged him a few days later. But he didn't go home. Instead, he went straight to the depot where he and his workmates collected their brooms and handcarts. Shouldering his broom, he marched out into the city streets and started sweeping. He did not, however, sweep as he used to in the old days, with a breath before each step and stroke of the broom, but hurriedly and without pride in his work, solely intent on saving time. He felt sickened by what he was doing and tormented by the knowledge that he was betraying the deeply held beliefs of a lifetime. Had no one's future been at stake but his own, he would have starved to death rather than abandon his principles. But there was Momo's ransom to collect, and this was the only way he knew of saving time. So he swept day and night without ever returning to his shack near the amphitheater. And when exhaustion overcame him, he would sit down on a park bench or even on the curb and snatch a few minutes' sleep, only to wake with a guilty start and carry on sweeping. He devoted just as little time to his meals, which took the form of hurried snacks wolfed down on the move. Beppo swept for weeks and months on end. Winter followed autumn, and still he toiled on. Winter, spring, summer came around, but he scarcely noticed the changing seasons. Preoccupied with saving Momo's 100,000 hours ransom, he swept and swept and swept. The townsfolk were too short of time themselves to pay any attention to the little old man, and the handful that did so tapped their foreheads as soon as he had gone, panting past, wielding his broom as if his life depended on it. Being taken for a fool was nothing new to Beppo, so he scarcely noticed that either. And on the few occasions when someone asked him what the hurry was, he would pause for a moment, eye the questioner with mingled alarm and sorrow, and put his finger to his lips. Hardest of all for the men in gray to tailor to their plans were Momo's friends among the children of the city, and even after her disappearance, they went on meeting at the amphitheater as often as they could. And they continued to invent new games in which a few old crates and boxes became castles and palaces or galleons that carried them on fabulous voyages around the world. And they also continued to tell each other stories. And in short, they behaved as if Momo were still with them. And by doing so, remarkably enough, they almost made it seem like she really was. Besides, they never for a moment doubted that she would return. They didn't discuss the subject, but the children, united by such an unspoken certainty, had no need to. Momo was one of them, and they formed the ever-present focus of all their activity, whether or not she actually was there in person. And the men in gray were powerless to meet this challenge head on. Unable to detach the children from Momo by bringing them under their direct control, they had to find some roundabout means of achieving the same end. And for this, they enlisted the children's elders. Not all grown-ups made suitable accomplices, of course, but there were plenty that did, and what was more, the men in the gray were cunning enough to turn the children's own weapons against them. Quite suddenly, one or two parents recalled how their offspring had paraded through the streets with placards and posters. Something must be done. More and more kids are being left on their own and neglected. You can't blame the parents. They just don't have time these days, so it's up to the authorities. Others joined in the chorus. We can't have all these youngsters loafing around, declared some. They obstruct the traffic. Road accidents caused by children are on the increase. Road accidents cost money that could be put to better use. Unsupervised children run wild, declared others. They become morally depraved and take to crime. The authorities must take steps to round them up. They must build centers where the youngsters can be molded into useful and efficient members of society. Children, declared still others, are the raw material of the future. A world dependent on computers and nuclear energy will need an army of experts and technicians to run it. Far from preparing our children for tomorrow's world, we are still allowed too many of them to squander years of their precious time on childish tomfoolery. It's a blot on our civilization and a crime against future generations. The time savers were all in favor of such a policy, naturally, and there were so many of them in the city by this time that they soon convinced all the authorities of the need to take prompt action. Before long, big buildings known as child depots sprang up in every neighborhood. Children whose parents were too busy to look after them had to be deposited there and could be collected when convenient. They were strictly forbidden to play in the streets or parks or anywhere else, and any child caught doing so was immediately carted off to the nearest depot, and its parents were heavily fined. None of Momo's friends escaped the new regulation. They were split up according to the districts they came from and consigned to various child depots, and once there, they were naturally forbidden to play games of their own devising. All games were selected for them by supervisors and had to have some useful educational purpose. The children learned these new games, but unlearned something else in the process. They forgot how to be happy, how to take pleasure in the little things, and last but not least, how to dream. Weeks passed, and the children began to look like time savers in miniature. Sullen, bored, and resentful, they did as they were told, and even when they were left to their own devices, they no longer knew what to do with themselves. All they could still do was make a noise, but it was an angry and ill-tempered noise, not the happy hullabaloo of their former times. The men in gray made no direct approach to them. There was no need. The net they had woven over the city was so close-meshed as to seem impenetrable. Not even the brightest and most ingenious children managed to slip through its toils. The amphitheater remained silent and deserted. The men in gray had done their work well, and all was in readiness for Momo's return. So Momo sat on the stone steps and waited in vain for her friends to turn up. She sat and waited all day, but no one came. Not a soul. The sun was sinking in the west, and the shadows grew longer and the air more chill, and at last Momo rose stiffly to her feet. She was hungry because no one had thought to bring her something to eat. And this had never happened before. I mean, even Guido and Beppo must have forgotten about her, she reflected. But she consoled herself with the thought that it was just an oversight. A silly mistake that would sort itself out the next day. And she went and knelt beside the tortoise, which had already tucked itself in for the night. And timidly she tapped the shell with her knuckles. The tortoise put its head out and looked at her. "Excuse me," Momo said. "I apologize for waking you, but can you tell me why none of my friends came? I waited all day long." "All gone," the shell spelled out. Momo read the words, but couldn't follow their meaning. "Oh well," she said cheerfully, "I'll find out tomorrow. My friends are bound to come again, aren't they?" "Never again," replied the tortoise. Momo stared at the faint letters with growing dismay. What do you mean?" she asked eventually. "Has something happened to them?" "All gone," she read again. She shook her head. "No," she said softly, "they can't have. You must be wrong, Cassiopeia. Why, I saw them only yesterday at our Grand Council of War, the ones that came to nothing." "Not yesterday," Cassiopeia replied. Momo remembered now. Professor Hora had told her that she would have to wait, like a seed slumbering in the earth, until it was ready to sprout, and she agreed without stopping to wonder how long that meant. But now the truth was beginning to dawn on her. "How long have I been away?" "A year and a day." Momo took some time to digest this, but "Beppo and Guido," she stammered, "surely they're still waiting for me." "No one left," she read. "But I don't understand." Momo's lips were trembling. "They can't all be gone. Not my friends, not the times we spent together." And very slowly a single word lit up on Cassiopeia's shell. "Past." For the first time in her life, Momo grasped the terrible finality of the word. Her heart had never felt so heavy. "But," she murmured helplessly, "but I'm still here." And she longed to cry, but couldn't. And a moment later, she felt the tortoise nudge her bare foot. "So am I," she read. "Yes," she said, smiling bravely. "You're here too, Cassiopeia, and I am glad of your company. Come on, let's go to bed." Picking up the tortoise, she carried it through the hole in the wall and down into her room, and she saw by the light of the setting sun
that all was as she had left it. Beppo had tidied the place up after its invasion by the men in gray, but everything was thick with dust and shrouded in cobwebs. And then she caught sight of an envelope propped against a can on the little table. The envelope, too, was covered with cobwebs. To Momo, it said. Momo's heart began to race. No one had ever written her a letter before, and she picked up the envelope and examined it from every angle, and then she tore it open and unfolded the slip of paper inside. Dear Momo, she read, I've moved. If you come back, please get in touch with me at once. I miss you, and I worry about you a lot. I hope nothing has happened to you. If you are hungry, go to Nino's place. I will foot the bill, so be sure to eat as much as you want. Nino will tell you the rest. Keep on loving me. I still love you. Yours ever, Guido. And Momo took a long time to decipher this letter, even though Guido had obviously been at pains to write as neatly and legibly as possible. The daylight had gone by the time she finished reading, but she felt comforted. She took the tortoise and put it on the bed beside her. You see, Cassiopeia, she said as she wrapped herself in the dusty blanket. I'm not alone after all. But the tortoise seemed to be asleep already, and Momo, who had pictured Guido's face with the utmost clarity, while reading his letter, never suspected that the envelope had been lying there for almost a year. She pillowed her cheek on it, feeling cold no longer. Chapter 14. 3 lunches, no answers. Towards noon on the following day, Momo tucked the tortoise under her arm and set off for Nino's inn. You'll see, Cassiopeia, she said. The mystery will soon be solved. Nino will tell us where Guido and Beppo are, and then we'll get the children, and we'll all be together again. Perhaps Nino and his wife will come along, too. You like my friends, I'm sure. I mean, we could even give a little party this evening, and I'll tell everyone about the flowers and the music and Professor Hora and everything. And, oh, I just can't wait to see them all again. First, though, I'm going to look forward to a good lunch. I'm absolutely famished. And so she chattered on merrily, feeling her in her jacket pocket now and then to reassure herself that Guido's letter was still there, and the tortoise fixed her with its wise old eyes and made no comment. Momo began to hum as she went, and then to sing, and the words and melodies were those of the voices that still seemed to ring in her ears as clearly as they had the day before, and she would never forget them. She knew that now. And then, abruptly, she broke off, because she had reached Nino's inn, but her first thought was that she must have gone astray, because where it once had stood a little old tavern with damp, stained walls and a vine growing around the door, the street was flanked by a long concrete box with a big plate glass windows, and the street had been asphalted and was humming with traffic. A big petrol station had sprung up opposite, and alongside it, an enormous office building. And there was lots of cars parked outside, and the new establishment and the neon sign above the entrance said Nino's Fast Food. Momo went inside, and she found it hard to get her bearings at first. Cemented into the floor beside the window were a number of tables with such spindly legs and tiny tops that they looked like toadstools. They were just the right height for grown-ups to eat standing up, which was fortunate since there were no chairs. Running along the other side of the room was a sort of fence made out of shiny chromium-plated tubing, and just beyond it stood a long row of glass cases containing ham and cheese sandwiches, sausages, plates of salad, pudding, cakes, countless other things to eat, many of which Momo had never seen before. She could only take in the scene by degrees because the room was so jam-packed with people. She always seemed to be getting in their way, and no matter where she stood, they elbowed her aside or jostled her along, and most of them were balancing trays laden with food and drink, and all were intent on grabbing a place at one of the little tables. Behind every man or woman that stood there eating in a frantic haste, several others waited impatiently for him or her to finish. And from time to time, acrimonious remarks were exchanged by those eating and those still waiting to eat. All of them looked glum and discontented. More people were shuffling slowly along by the barrier, taking plates or bottles and cardboard cups from the glass cases as they passed. And Momo was astonished. So they could help themselves to whatever they liked? There was no one around to stop them or ask them to pay for what they took. Well, perhaps everything was free, Momo reflected, and well, that would certainly account for the crush. At last she spotted Nino. Almost obscured by customers, he was seated in front of a cash register at the very end of the long row of glass cases, pressing buttons, taking money, and giving change without a stop. So he was the person who took the money. The rail fenced people in so they couldn't get to the tables without passing him. Nino, she cried, trying to squeeze through the crowd. She called again and waved Guido's letter, but Nino didn't hear. The electronic cash register was bleeping too loudly. Plucking up her courage, Momo climbed over the rail and wormed her way along the line to where Nino sat. He glanced up because two of the customers had started to protest. At the sight of Momo, his glum expression disappeared in a flash. "So you're back," he exclaimed, beaming just as he used to in the old days. "This is a nice surprise." "Get a move on," called an angry voice. "Tell that kid to stand in line like the rest of us. Cheeky young whippersnapper, barking her way to the front like that." Nino made appeasing gestures. "I won't be a moment," he said. "Be patient, can't you?" "Anyone could jump in line at this rate," another voice chimed in. "Hurry up. We don't have much time to spare as she does." "Look, Momo," Nino whispered hurriedly, "take whatever you like. Guido will pay for it all, but you'll have to line up with the rest. You heard what they said." Before Momo could reply, she was pushed past the cash desk by the people behind her. There was nothing for it but to do as the others did, joining at the end of the line, and she took a tray from a shelf and a knife and a fork and a spoon from a box, and because she needed both hands for the tray, she dumped Cassiopeia on top. And rather flustered by now, Momo took a look at random things from glass cases as she was propelled along step by step and arranged them around the tortoise. And she ended up with an odd assorted meal, a piece of fried fish, jam puff, a sausage, a meat pie, plastic mug of lemonade, and surrounded by food on all sides, Cassiopeia retired to her shell without comment. And when Momo at last reached the cash desk, she hurriedly asked Nino if he knew where Guido was. And Nino nodded. "Our Guido's a celebrity these days. I mean, we're all very proud of him. He's one of us, after all. He's on TV and radio every week, and they're always writing about him in the papers. I even had 2 reporters here myself last week asking about the old days. Told him how Guido used to." "Move along in front," cried an irate voice. "But why doesn't he come around anymore?" Momo asked. "Ah, well," Nino muttered, fidgeting because his customers were making him nervous. "He doesn't have the time, you see. He's got more important things on his mind. Besides, there's nothing doing at the amphitheater, not now." "What's the matter with you?" called another indignant voice. "You think we like hanging around here or something?" Momo dug her heels in. "Where's Guido living now?" she asked. "Somewhere on Green Hill," Nino replied. He's got a fine house, so they say, with a great big garden. But please, Momo, do me a favor and come back later." Momo didn't really want to move on. She had a lot more questions, but someone above her in the back, again, she took her tray to one of the toadstool tables and actually managed to get a place, although the table was so high that her nose was on level with it. And when she slid the tray on the top, the neighboring grown-ups eyed Cassiopeia with disgust. "Ugh! See the kind of thing we have to put up with nowadays?" someone said to the person beside him. And the other man growled, "What do you expect, these kids?" They left at that and ignored Momo from then on. Eating was quite a problem because she could scarcely see what was on her tray, but being very hungry, she devoured every last morsel. And then in her anxiety to discover what had become of Beppo, she rejoined the line. Although she wasn't hungry anymore, she was too afraid people might get angry with her if she simply stood there, and so that she filled her tray with another assortment of things from cases. "Where's Beppo?" she asked when she finally made it back to the cash desk. "He waited for you for ages," Nino said hurriedly, fearful of upsetting his customers again. "He thought something terrible had happened to you. He kept on talking about men in gray or something of the kind. And, well, you know, old Beppo. I mean, he always was a bit eccentric." "You there," called a voice from the back line. "When are we going to get some service?" "Right away, sir," Nino called back. "What happened to him?" "Then he started pestering the police," Nino went on, nervously massaging his brow, "and he asked them to look for you and made a proper nuisance. And, well, the next thing, they'd put him in some sort of mental hospital, and that's all I can tell you." Hell and damnation, someone else bellowed. Is this a fast food joint or a dentist waiting room? What are you doing, holding a family reunion? Well, yes, kind of, Nino said apologetically. Is he still there? Asked Momo. Nino shook his head. I don't think so. I'm told that they pronounced him harmless and let him go. So where is he now? I have no idea, Momo. Honestly, I haven't now. Please be a good girl and move on. And again, Momo was jostled past the cash desk by the people behind her. And again, she waited for a place at one of the toadstool tables. And she polished off her second tray full of food with a good deal less gusto than the first, but food was food, and she wouldn't have dreamed of leaving any. She still had to find out what had become of the children who used to keep her company. There was nothing for it but to stand in line once more and shuffle past the glass cases and load her tray with food rather than invite hostile remarks. And it seemed an eternity before she reached the cash desk again. What about the children? What's become of them? Oh, that's all changed, said Nino, breaking out in a sweat at her reappearance. I can't explain right now. You'll see how rushed I am. But why don't they come anymore? She insisted. Nowadays, kids with no one to look after them are put in child depots, and they aren't allowed to be left to themselves anymore because, well, the long and short of it is they're taken care of. Hurry up, you slow coaches, came an indignant chorus. We'd like to eat sometime. Momo was looking incredulous. Child depots, she repeated. Is that where my friends really wanted? They weren't consulted, said Nino, fiddling with the keys of his cash register. It's not up to the kids to decide these things for themselves. Child depots keeps them off the streets, and that's the main thing, isn't it? Momo said nothing, just looked at him, and Nino squirmed under his searching gaze. Damn it all, shouted yet another angry voice in the background. This is the limit. You must hold a prayer meeting. Hold it somewhere else. What am I going to do now? Momo asked him in a small voice. Without my friends. Nino shrugged and kneaded his hands together. Be reasonable, Momo, he said, drawing a deep breath. Come back some other time. I really can't discuss your problems now. You're welcome to eat here anytime you like, but if I were you, I'd report to one of these child depots, and they will look after you and keep you occupied, and they'd even give you a proper education. And besides, you'll end up in one anyway if you go on wandering around on your own like this. Momo said nothing, just gazed at him as before. And when the crowd swept her along, she mechanically went to one of the tables and just as mechanically forced herself to eat a third lunch. That was all she could do to get it down. It tasted so much like cardboard and wood shavings, she felt sick. And then, tucking Cassiopeia under her arm, she walked silently to the door without a backward glance. Hey, Momo, called Nino, who had spotted her at the last moment. Wait a bit, you never told me where you've been all this time. But the next customer was already drumming his fingers on the cash register, and Nino rang up the total of the man's money and gave him some change, and the smile had long since left his face. I've had masses to eat, Momo told Cassiopeia when they were back at the amphitheater. Far too much to tell the truth, but somehow I still feel empty inside. And after a while, she added, anyway, I couldn't have told Nino about the flowers and the music. There wasn't time. And I don't think he would have understood. There was another pause before she went on. Never mind. Tomorrow we'll go look for Guido. You're sure to like him, Cassiopeia, believe me. But all that lit up on Cassiopeia's shell was a great big question mark. Chapter 15, Found and Lost. Momo got up early the next morning and set off in search of Guido's house, and Cassiopeia came too, of course. Momo knew where Green Hill was, a residential suburb several miles from the amphitheater. It lay on the other side of the city near the housing development's identical rows of identical flats. Green Hill was a long walk. And although Momo was used to going without shoes, her bare feet were aching by the time she got there, so she sat down on the curb to rest a while. It was a very smart neighborhood. The streets were broad and clean and deserted, in gardens enclosed by high walls and iron railings. Fine old trees reared their branches to the sky, and most of the houses set in these gardens were long, low, flat-roofed villas built of concrete and glass. The smooth expanses of lawn in front of them were lush and green. They positively cried out for children to turn somersaults on them. But not a soul could be seen strolling or playing anywhere. Presumably, the owners didn't have time. Momo turned to Cassiopeia. If only I knew how to find out where Guido lives, she sighed. You will, the tortoise signaled. You really think so? Momo said hopefully. Hey, you grubby little brat, someone said behind her. What are you doing here? Momo turned to see a man in a spotless white jacket. She didn't know what such jackets were worn by the servants of the rich. Good morning, she said, getting off the curb. I'm looking for Guido's house. Nino told me he lives here now. Whose house? Guido's. He is a friend of mine, you see. The man in the white jacket glared at her suspiciously. He had left the garden gate ajar, and Momo could see inside. Some dogs were frisking about on a big stretch of lawn, and a fountain was playing in front of the house. And overhead, in a blossom-covered tree, perched a pair of peacocks. Oh, Momo exclaimed, what pretty birds! And she started to go inside for a closer look, but the man in the white jacket grabbed her by the scruff of the neck. No, you don't, he said. Some nerve you've got, I must say. And then he let go of her and wiped his fingers on his handkerchief, looking as if he had just touched something unpleasant. Momo pointed through the gate. Does all that belong to you? She inquired. No, snapped the man in the white jacket, sounding more unfriendly than ever. Now clear off. You've no business here. Oh, yes, I have, Momo said firmly. I've got to find Guido Guide. He's expecting me. Do you know him? There aren't any guides around here, the man retorted, and he turned on one heel, and he had gone back to the garden and was about to slam the gate, and a thought seemed to strike him. You don't mean Girolamo, the TV star? That's right, Momo said eagerly. Guido Guide, that's his real name. Can you tell me where his house is? Is he really expecting you? The man demanded. Yes, he truly is, said Momo. He is a friend of mine. He pays for everything I eat at Nino's. The man in the white jacket raised his eyebrows and shook his head. These showbiz people, he said acidly. They certainly got some crazy notions sometimes. Well, all right, if you really think he'll welcome a visit from you, his house is right at the end of the street. So saying, he slammed the gate behind him. The word show off appeared on Cassiopeia's shell, but only for a moment. The last house in the street was surrounded by a high wall, and the gate was made of sheet metal like all the rest, so it was impossible to see inside. There wasn't a nameplate on it or a doorbell anywhere in sight. Can this really be Guido's new house? It doesn't look at all like the kind of place he'd choose. It is, Cassiopeia signaled. But why is it all shut up? Momo asked. I'll never get in. Wait, was Cassiopeia's advice. Momo sighed. I may have to wait a long time. Even if it's Guido's home, how will he know I'm here? The tortoise's shell lit up. He'll come, it said. And so Momo sat down right outside the gate and waited patiently. Nothing happened for such a long time that she began to wonder if Cassiopeia had made a mistake for once. Are you absolutely positive? She asked after a while. Cassiopeia's reply was quite unexpected. Her shell said simply, Goodbye. Momo gave a start. What do you mean, Cassiopeia? You aren't leaving me, are you? I mean, where are you going? To look for you, was Cassiopeia's still more cryptic response. And at that moment, the gate swung open without warning, and out shot a long, low, elegant car. Momo, who jumped back only just in time, fell head over heels, and the car sped on for several yards and then screeched to a halt. An instant later, Guido jumped out. Momo! He cried, flinging his arms wide. If it isn't my own beloved little Momo! Momo scrambled to her feet and ran to him. Guido snatched her up in his arms and covered her cheeks with kisses and danced around in the road with her. Did you hurt yourself? He asked breathlessly. But instead of waiting for a reply, he went on talking 19 to a dozen. Sorry, I gave you a fright, but I'm in a tearing hurry. Late again as usual. Where have you been all this time? You must tell me the whole story. I'd give you up for lost, you know? I mean, did you get my letter? Yes? So it was still there, eh? Okay, fine. So you went and had a meal at Nino's. Did you? Did you enjoy it? Oh, Momo, we've such a lot to tell each other. So much has happened in the last few months. How are you? Anyway, what's the matter? Lost your tongue? And what about old Beppo? What's he up to? And I haven't seen him in a month of Sundays. And the children, what about them? Oh, Momo, I can't tell you how often I think of the times we spent together. When I used to tell you stories. Good times they were. But everything's different now. You can't imagine how different. Momo had made several attempts to answer his questions, but since his torrent of words never dried up, she simply watched and waited. And Guido looked different from the old days. He was well groomed and he smelled nice, but there was something curiously unfamiliar about him. Meanwhile, some people had emerged from the limousine and walked over to them, a man in a chauffeur's uniform and three hard-faced, heavily made-up young women. Is the child hurt? Asked one of them, sounding less anxious than disapproving. No, not a bit, Guido assured her. We gave her a fright, that's all. Serves her right for loitering outside the gate, said the second young woman. Guido laughed, but this is Momo. This is my old friend Momo. The third young woman raised her eyebrows. So, she really exists, does she? I always thought she was a figment of your imagination. Well, we must issue a press release at once. Gerolamo reunited with his fairy princess. Something along those lines. I'll go get onto it at once. What a story. The public will lap it up. What do you say, Momo? Asked the first young woman, fixing Momo with an artificial smile. Surely you'd like to have your picture in the paper, wouldn't you? Leave her alone, snapped Guido. The second young woman glanced at her wristwatch. We're going to miss our flight if we don't get a move on, and you know what that would mean. God almighty, Guido protested. Can't I even have a quiet chat with my long-lost friend? He turned to Momo with a rueful grin. You see, they never give me a moment's peace, these slave drivers of mine. Never. Well, suit yourself, but we're only doing our job, the second woman said tartly. That's what you pay us for, Lord and Master, to arrange your schedule, to see that you stick to it. Guido gave in. Okay, we better get going. Tell you what, Momo, why not come to the airport with us and we can talk on the way, and afterwards my chauffeur will drive you home, all right? And without even waiting for an answer, he seized Momo's hand and towed her to the car. The three secretaries got in behind while Guido sat up front with Momo wedged in beside him. Right, he said, so I'm listening. But first things first, how come you disappeared like that? Momo was on the point of telling him about Professor Hora and the hour lilies when one of the secretaries leaned forward. Sorry to butt in, but I've just had the most fabulous idea. We've simply got to introduce Momo to the top brass at Fantasy Films. She'd be perfect for this title role in your next film, the one about the girl who becomes a vagrant. Think of what a sensation it would make. Momo starring Momo. Didn't you hear what I said? Snapped Guido. I don't want her dragged into anything of the kind. Is that clear? The young woman bridled. I just don't get it, she said. Most people would jump at such a heaven-sent opportunity. Well, I'm not most people, Guido shouted in a sudden fury, and he turned to Momo. Forgive me, you may not understand this, but I don't want these vultures sinking their talons into you as well as me. At that, all three secretaries sniffed and looked offended. Guido groaned aloud and clutched his head. Producing a small silver pillbox from his pocket, he took out a capsule and gulped it down. Nobody spoke for a minute or two. At length, Guido turned to the trio behind him. I apologize, he rumbled wearily. I wasn't referring to you. My nerves are on edge, that is all. We know, said the first young woman. We're getting used to it. And now, Guido went on, smiling down at Momo rather wryly, let us not talk about anything except the two of us. One more question before it's too late, the second young woman broke in. We'll be there any minute. Couldn't you at least let me do a quick interview with the kid? That's enough, roared Guido, beside himself with rage. I want a word with Momo in private. It means a lot to me. How many more times do I have to tell you? The second young woman was just as irate. You're always complaining because the publicity I get you doesn't pack a big enough punch. You're right, Guido groaned, but not now. It's too bad, the second young woman pursued. A human interest story like this would be a real tearjerker, but have it your way. Maybe we could run it later on when... No, Guido cut in. Neither now nor later, not ever. Now kindly shut up while Momo and I have a talk. Well, pardon me, the young woman retorted angrily. It's your publicity we're discussing, not mine. Think carefully. Can you really afford to pass up such an opportunity at this stage in your career? No, I can't, Guido cried in desperation, but Momo stays out of it. And now, for pity's sake, leave us in peace for 5 minutes. The secretaries relapsed into silence, and limply Guido drew a hand across his eyes. You see how far gone I am? He patted Momo's arm and gave a wry little laugh. I couldn't go back now, even if I wanted to. I'm beyond redemption. Guido's still Guido, remember? Well, Guido isn't Guido anymore, believe me, Momo. There's nothing more dangerous in my life than dreams that come true, at least when they come true like mine. I have nothing left to dream about.
and not even you could teach me to dream again. I'm fed up to the teeth with everything and everyone. He stared morosely out the window. The most I could do now would be to stop telling stories and keep mum, if not for the rest of my life, then at least until people have forgotten all about me, and I was poor and unknown again. But poverty without dreams, no, Momo, that would be sheer hell. I'd sooner stay where I am. That's another kind of hell, but at least it's a comfortable one. Guido broke off. I don't know why I'm rambling on like this. You can't have understood a word. Momo just looked at him. What she understood first and foremost was that Guido was ill, gravely ill, and she suspected that the men in gray were at the bottom of it, but she had no idea how to cure him if he didn't want to be cured. I've done nothing but talk about myself, he said. It's high time you just told me about your own doings. And just then the car drew up outside the airport terminal, and they all got out and hurried into the foyer where a pair of uniformed stewardesses were already waiting for Guido. Some newspaper reporters took pictures of him and asked questions, but the stewardesses started fussing because there were only a few minutes left before takeoff. And Guido bent down and gazed into Momo's eyes, and suddenly his own eyes were filled with tears. Listen, he said, lowering his voice so the others couldn't hear. Stay with me, Momo. I'll take you along on this trip. I'll take you wherever you want to go. You can live in that fine new house of mine and dress in silk and satin like a real princess. Just be there and listen to me. That's all I ask. And if you did, perhaps I would manage to think up some proper stories like the ones I used to tell, you know? You know what I mean? Just say yes, Momo, and everything will be all right again. Help me. I beg you. Momo's heart bled for Guido, and she longed so much to help him, but she sensed that he was wrong. He would have to become Guido again, and it wouldn't help him at all if she stopped being Momo. And her eyes, too, filled with tears, and she shook her head. Guido understood. He just had time to nod sadly before he was hustled off by the 3 secretaries he employed to do just that. And he gave one last wave in the distance, and Momo waved back. And then he was hidden from view. Momo could have told him many things, but she hadn't managed to say a word throughout their brief reunion. She felt as if by finding him again, she had really and truly lost him at last. Slowly, she turned and made her way across the crowded foyer. And just as she reached the exit, she was smitten by a sudden thought. She had lost Cassiopeia as well. Chapter 16, Loneliness. Where to? Asked the chauffeur when Momo got in beside him. She looked perplexed. Where did she want to go? She had to look for Cassiopeia, but where? Where had she lost her? The tortoise hadn't been with them on the drive to the airport, that much she knew for sure, so the likeliest place would be outside of Guido's house. But then she remembered the words on Cassiopeia's shell. Goodbye, and to look for you. Of course, Cassiopeia had known beforehand that they would lose each other, so she had gone looking for her. But where should she, Momo, go looking for Cassiopeia? Make up your mind, said the chauffeur, beating an impatient tattoo on the steering wheel. I've got better things to do with my time than take you joyriding. Back to Guido's house, please, Momo replied. The chauffeur looked faintly surprised. I thought the boss said to drive you home. You mean you're going to live at his place? No, said Momo, but I lost something on the road outside and I've got to find it. That suited the chauffeur, who had to go back there anyway, and as soon as they reached Guido's gate, Momo got out and started peering in all directions. Cassiopeia, she called softly again and again. Cassiopeia. The chauffeur stuck his head out the window. What are you looking for? Professor Hora's tortoise, Momo told him. Her name is Cassiopeia, and she always knows what's going to happen half an hour in advance, and so she can make words light up on her shell too, and that's how she tells you what the future holds in store, and I've simply got to find her. Would you help me look for her, please? I have no time for jokes, snarled the chauffeur and drove on. The remote controlled gate opened and closed behind him. Undaunted, Momo continued the search on her own. She combed the entire street, but Cassiopeia was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she's on her way back to the amphitheater, thought Momo, so she slowly retraced her steps, calling the tortoise by name all the way. She peered into every nook and cranny, every ditch and gutter, but in vain. And although Momo didn't get back to the amphitheater till late at night, she searched it as thoroughly as the darkness would allow. She had nursed a vague hope that Cassiopeia might, by some miraculous means, have reached home before her. But she knew in her heart of hearts that the tortoise's slow rate of progress rendered this impossible. At long last, she crept into bed, really alone for the first time ever. And once she had given Cassiopeia up for lost, Momo decided to concentrate on trying to find Beppo. She spent the next few weeks roaming aimlessly through the city in search of him. No one could give her any clue to his whereabouts, so her one remaining hope was that they might simply bump into each other. The vastness of the city made this forlorn hope. She had as little chance of meeting as a shipwrecked sailor had that his message in a bottle would be netted by a fishing boat 10,000 miles from the desert island where he had tossed it into the sea. For all that, Momo kept telling herself she and Beppo might be quite close to each other. I mean, who could tell how often she had passed some spot where he had just been only an hour, a minute, or even a moment or two before? And conversely, how often had Beppo crossed a square or rounded a street corner only minutes or moments after her? Encouraged by this thought, Momo often waited in the same spot for hours. I mean, she had to move on sooner or later, however, so even that was no insurance against their missing each other by a hair's breadth. How useful Cassiopeia would have been. The tortoise could have signaled, wait, or keep going. But as it was, Momo never knew what to do for the best. She was afraid of missing Beppo if she waited, and just as afraid of missing him if she didn't. She also kept her eyes open for the children who used to come and play with her in the old days, but she never saw a single one. She never saw any children at all, though this was hardly surprising in view of Nino's remark about their being taken care of. Momo herself was never picked up by a policeman or other adult and taken off to a child depot, for the very good reason that she was under constant surveillance by the men in gray. Not that she knew it, confinement to a child depot wouldn't have suited their plans for her. Although she ate at Nino's restaurant every day, she never managed to say any more to him than she had on their first occasion. He was always in just as much of a rush, and he never had the time. Weeks became months, and still Momo pursued her solitary existence. One evening, while perched on the balustrade of a bridge, she sighted the small bent figure of a man on another bridge in the distance, wielding a broom as if his life depended on it. Momo shouted and waved, thinking it was Beppo, but the man didn't stop work for an instant. And she ran as fast as she could, but by the time she reached the other bridge, there was no one in sight. I guess it wasn't him, she told herself consolingly. No, it can't have been. I know the way Beppo works. Some days she stayed at home at the amphitheater on the off chance Beppo might look in to see if she was back. And if she was out when he came, he would naturally assume that she was still away. I mean, it tormented her to think that this might have already happened a week or even a day ago, and so she waited in vain. And eventually she painted the words, "I'm back," on the wall of her room in big bold letters, but hers were the only eyes that ever saw them. The one thing that never forsook Momo in all that time was her vivid recollection of Professor Hora, and the hour lilies, and the music. She had only to shut her eyes and listen to her heart, and she could see the blossoms in all their radiant splendor and hear the voices singing. And even though the words and melodies were forever changing, she found she could repeat the words and sing the melodies as easily as she had on the very first day. And sometimes she spent whole days sitting alone on the steps, talking and singing to herself with no one there to hear but the trees and the birds and the time-worn stones. There are many kinds of solitude, but Momo's was a solitude few people ever know
and even fewer experience with such intensity. She felt as if she were imprisoned in a vault, heaped with priceless treasures, an ever-growing hoard that threatened to crush the life out of her. There was no way out either. The vault was impenetrable, and she was far too deeply buried underneath a mountain of time to attract anyone's attention. There were even moments that she wished she had never heard of the music or seen the flowers. And yet she had been offered a choice. Nothing in the world would have induced her to part with her memories of them, not even the prospect of death. Yes, death, for now she discovered that there are treasures capable of destroying those who have no one to share them with. Every few days, Momo made the long walk to Guido's house and waited outside the gates for hours in the hopes of seeing him again. By now, she was ready to agree to anything, ready to stay with him and listen to him. Whether or not things became as they once were, but the gate remained firmly shut. Only a few months passed this way. Yet Momo had never lived through such an eternity. No clock or calendar can truly measure time, just as no words can truly describe the loneliness that afflicted her. Suffice it to say that if she had succeeded in finding her way back to Professor Hora, and she tried again and again, she would have begged him to cut off her supply of time, or to let her remain with him at Nowhere House forevermore. But she couldn't find the way without Cassiopeia's help, and Cassiopeia, whether long since back with Professor Hora or lost and roaming the big wide world, had never reappeared. Instead, something quite different happened. While wandering through the city one day, Momo ran into Paolo, Franco, and Maria, the girl who always used to carry her little sister Rosa around with her, and all three children had changed so much she hardly recognized them. They were dressed in a kind of gray uniform, and their faces wore a strangely stiff and lifeless expression. They barely smiled, even when Momo hailed them with delight. "I've been looking for you for so long," she said breathlessly. "Will you come back to the amphitheater and play with me?" The three children looked at each other and then shook their heads. "But you'll come tomorrow, won't you? Or the next day?" And again the trio shook their heads. "Oh, do come," Momo pleaded. "You always used to in the old days." "In the old days, yes," said Paolo, "but everything's different now. We aren't allowed to fritter our time away." "We never did," Momo protested. "It was nice," Maria said, "but that's not the point." And the three of them hurried on with Momo trotting beside them. "Where are you off to?" she asked. "To our play class," Franco told her. "That's where they teach us how to play." Momo looked puzzled. "Play what?" "Well, today we're playing data retrieval," Franco explained. "It's a very useful game, but you have to concentrate like mad." "Well, how's it go?" "We all pretend to be punch cards, and each card carries various bits of information about us: age, height, weight, and so on. And not our real age, height, and weight, of course, because that would make it too easy. So sometimes we're just long strings of letters and numbers like MUX/763/Y. And then anyway, we're shuffled and fed into a card index, and then one of us has to pick out a particular card, and he has to ask questions in such a way that all the other cards are eliminated and only the right card is left. And then the winner is the person who does it the quickest." "Is that fun?" Momo asked, looking rather doubtful. "That's not the point," Maria repeated uneasily. "Anyway, you shouldn't talk like that." "Well, so what's the point?" Momo insisted. "The point is," Paolo told her, "is useful for the future." And by this time, they had reached a big gray building, and the sign over the gate said, "Child Depot." "I have so much to tell you," Momo said. "Well, maybe we'll see each other again sometime," Maria said sadly. And as they stood there, more children appeared, and they streamed in through the gateway, all looking just the same as Momo's former playmates. It was much nicer playing with you, Franco said suddenly. We used to enjoy thinking up games for ourselves, but our supervisors say they didn't teach us anything useful. Couldn't you just run away? Momo hazarded. The trio shook their heads and glanced for fear around someone might have overheard. Well, I tried it a couple times in the beginning, Franco whispered, but it's hopeless. They always catch you again. You shouldn't talk like that, said Maria. After all, we're taken care of now. And they all fell silent and stared gloomily into space. At last, Momo summoned up her courage and said, well, couldn't you just take me in with you? I'm so lonely these days. And just then, something extraordinary happened. Before the children could reply, they were whisked into the courtyard of the building like iron filings attracted by a giant magnet, and the gates clanged shut behind them. And after a minute, when she had recovered from her shock, Momo cautiously approached the gates, intending to knock or ring and beg to be allowed to join in no matter what the game the children were playing. And she had barely taken a couple of steps, however, when she stopped dead, rooted to the spot with terror. A man in gray had suddenly materialized between her and the gates. Pointless, he said, with a thin-lipped smile and the inevitable cigar jutting from the corner of his mouth. Don't even try it. Letting you in would be against our interests. Why? Momo asked. She felt as if her limbs were slowly filling with icy water. Because we have other plans for you, said the man in gray, blowing a smoke ring that coiled itself around her neck and took a long time to disperse. People were passing by, all in too much of a hurry to give them a second glance. Momo pointed to the man in gray and tried to call for help, but no sound escaped her lips. Save it, said the man in gray with a bleak, mirthless laugh. You ought to know us better than that. You know how powerful we are. No one can help you. Now we've got all your friends, and you're at our mercy too. But we've decided to go easy on you. Why? Momo managed to get out. Because we'd like you to do us a little favor. Now, be sensible, and you can do yourself and your friends a lot of good. What do you say? All right, whispered Momo. And the man in gray gave another thin-lipped smile. Then we'll meet at midnight to talk it over. She nodded mutely, but the man in gray had already vanished. All that marked the spot where he had stood was a wisp of cigar smoke. He hadn't told her where they were to meet. 17 is the square. Momo was too scared to go back to the amphitheater. She felt sure that the men in gray would turn up there for their midnight meeting, and the thought of being there all alone with him in the described ruins filled her with terror. No, she never wished to see him again, neither there nor anywhere else. Whatever his proposition might be, it boded no good for her and her friends. That was as plain as a pikestaff. But where should she hide from him? A crowded place seemed to be best, although no one had taken any notice before. If the man in gray really tried to harm her and she called for help, people would surely hear and come to her aid. Besides, she told herself she'd be harder to find in a crowd than on her own. So Momo spent the rest of the afternoon walking the busiest streets and squares, surrounded by jostling pedestrians. All through the evening and well into the night, she continued to trudge in a big circle that brought her back to her starting point. Around and around she went, swept along by a fast-flowing tide of humanity, until she had completed no fewer than 3 of these circuits. After keeping this up for so many hours, her weary feet began to ache. It grew later and later, but still she walked, half asleep, on and on and on. Just a little rest, she told herself at last, just a teeny little rest. And then I'll be more on my guard. Parked beside the curb was a little 3-wheeled delivery truck laden with an assortment of snacks, sacks, and cartons.
Momo climbed aboard and found herself a nice soft sack and leaned her back against it. She drew up her weary feet and tucked them under her skirt. My, did that feel good? She heaved a sigh of relief and snuggled up against the sack and was asleep before she knew it. But she was haunted by the weirdest dreams. In one of them, she saw old Beppo with his broom held crosswise like a balancing pole, teetering along a tightrope suspended above a dark chasm. "Where's the other end?" she heard him call over and over. "I can't see the other end." And the tightrope did indeed seem infinitely long, so long that it stretched away into the darkness in both directions. And Momo yearned to help the old man, but she couldn't even attract his attention. He was too high up and too far away. And then she saw Guido pulling a paper streamer out of his mouth, and he pulled and pulled, but the streamer was endless and unbreakable. And in fact, he was already standing on a big mound of paper, and it seemed that he was gazing at her imploringly, as if he would suffocate unless she came to his rescue. And she tried to run to him, but her feet became entangled in the coils of paper, and the more she struggled to free herself, the more entangled she became. And then she saw the children. They were all as flat as playing cards, and each of them had a pattern of little holes punched on it. And every time the cards were shuffled, they had to sort themselves out and be punched with a new pattern of holes. And the card children were crying bitterly. But all Momo could hear was a sort of clattering sound as they were shuffled yet again and fluttered down on top of each other. "Stop!" she shouted. But her feeble voice was drowned by the clatter, which grew louder and louder until finally it woke her up. And it was dark, and for a moment she couldn't think of where she was. And then she remembered climbing aboard the delivery truck, and she realized it was on the move. And that's what had woken her, the sound of the engine. Momo wiped her cheeks, which were still wet with tears, and wondered where she could be. The truck had evidently been on the move for some time because it was in a different part of the city. And at this late hour, not a soul could be seen in the streets. Not a light showed anywhere in the tall buildings that flanked them. The truck was going quite slowly, and Momo, without stopping to think, jumped out. She began walking in the opposite direction, eager to get back to the crowded streets that seemed to offer protection from the man in gray. And then, remembering her nightmare, she came to a halt. The sound of the engine gradually faded until silence enveloped the darkened street. She would stop running away, Momo decided. She had done so in the hope of saving herself, and all this time she had been preoccupied with herself, with her own loneliness and fear, when it was really her friends who were in trouble. If anyone could save them, she could. Remote as the chances of persuading the men in gray to release them might be, she might at least try. And once she reached this conclusion, she felt a mysterious change come over her. Her feelings of fear and helplessness had reached such a pitch that they were suddenly transformed into their opposites. Having overcome them, she felt courageous and self-confident enough to tackle any power on earth. More precisely, she had ceased to worry about herself. And now she wanted to meet the men in gray. She wanted it at all costs. "I must go to the amphitheater at once," she told herself. "Perhaps it isn't too late. Perhaps he will be waiting for me." That, however, was easier said than done. She didn't know where she was, and she had the least idea which direction to take, but she started walking anyway. On and on she walked through the dark, silent streets. Being barefoot, she couldn't even hear her own footsteps, and every time she turned a corner, she hoped to see something that would tell her she was on the right track, some landmark she recognized. But she never did. And she couldn't ask the way either, because the only living creature she saw was a grimy, emaciated dog that was foraging for scraps in a rubbish heap and fled in panic at her approach. At last, she came to a huge, deserted square. It wasn't a handsome square with trees or a fountain in the middle, but an empty, featureless expanse fringed with buildings whose dark shapes stood outlined against the night sky. Momo set off across the square, and when she reached the middle, a clock began to chime not far away. It chimed a good many times, so perhaps it was already midnight. If the man in gray was waiting for her at the amphitheater, Momo reflected she had no chance at all of getting there in time. He would go away without seeing her, and any chance of saving her friends would be gone, perhaps forever. She chewed her knuckles, wondering what to do, and she had absolutely no idea. "Here I am!" she called into the darkness as loud as she could. She had no real hope that the man in gray would hear her, but she was wrong. Scarcely had the last chime died away when the lights appeared in all the streets that led into the big empty square, faint at first, but steadily growing brighter, drawing nearer. And then Momo realized that they were the headlights of innumerable cars, all converging on the spot where she stood. Dazzled by the glare, no matter which way she turned, she shielded her eyes with her hand. So, they were coming after all. But Momo hadn't expected them to come in such strength, and for a moment, all her newfound courage deserted her. Hemmed in and unable to escape, she shrank as far as she could into her baggy old jacket. And then, remembering the hour lilies and the mighty chorus of voices, she instantly felt comforted. The strength flowed back into her limbs. Meanwhile, with their engines purring softly, the cars continued their slow advance, and at last they stopped, bumper to bumper, in a circle whose central point was Momo herself. The men in gray got out. Momo couldn't see how many of them there were because they remained outside the ring of headlights, but she sensed many eyes were on her, unfriendly eyes, and a shiver ran down her spine. No one spoke for a while, neither Momo nor any of the men in gray, and then a flat, expressionless voice broke the silence. "I see," it said. "So, this is Momo, the girl who thought she could defy us. Just look at her now, the miserable creature." These words were followed by a dry, rattling sound that vaguely resembled a chorus of mocking laughter. "Careful," hissed another gray voice. "You know how dangerous she can be. It's no use trying to deceive her." Momo pricked up her ears at this. "Very well," said the first voice from the darkness beyond the headlights. "Let's try the truth for a change." Another long silence fell, and Momo sensed that the men in gray were afraid to tell the truth. So afraid that it imposed a tremendous strain on them. She heard what sounded like a gasp of exertion from 1,000 throats. And at long last, one of the disembodied voices began to speak. It came from a different direction, but it was just as flat and expressionless as all the others. "All right. Let's be blunt. You're all on your own, little girl. Your friends are out of reach. So you've no one to share your time with."
We planned it that way. You see how powerful we are? There's no point in trying to resist us. What did they amount to, all these lonely hours of yours? A curse and a burden. Nothing more. You're completely cut off from the rest of mankind.
Momo listened and said nothing. "Sooner or later," the voice droned on, "you won't be able to endure it any longer. Tomorrow, next week, next year, it's all the same to us. We shall simply bide our time because we know that in due course, you'll come crawling to us and say, 'I'll do anything at all, as long as you relieve me of my burden.' But perhaps you've already reached that stage. You only have to say." Momo shook her head. "So you won't let us help you?" the voice pursued coldly. Momo felt an icy breeze envelop her from all sides at once, but she gritted her teeth and shook her head again. She knows what time is, whispered another voice. That proves she really was with a certain person, the first voice replied, also in a whisper. Aloud, it asked, Do you know Professor Hora? Momo nodded. You actually paid him a visit? She nodded again. So, you know about the hour lilies? She nodded a third time. Oh, yes, how well she knew. There was another longish silence when the voice began to speak again. It came from another direction. You love your friends, don't you? Another nod. And you'd like to set them free? Another nod. You could, if only you would. Momo was shivering with cold in every limb. She drew her jacket tightly around her. It wouldn't take much to save them. You help us, we help you. It's only fair, isn't it? The voice was coming from yet another direction. Momo stared intently at its source. The thing is, we would like to make Professor Ora's acquaintance, but we don't know where he lives. All we want is for you to show us the way. That's right, Momo. Listen carefully so you know we're being honest with you and we mean what we say. In return, we'll give you back your friends and let you all lead the carefree, happy-go-lucky life you used to enjoy so much. If that isn't a worthwhile offer, what is? And Momo opened her mouth for the first time. It was quite an effort to speak at all. Her lips felt so numb. What do you want with Professor Hora? She asked. I told you we want to make his acquaintance, the voice said sharply, and the air grew colder. That's all you need to know. Momo said nothing, just waited. I don't understand you, said the voice. Think of yourself and your friends. Why worry about Professor Hora? He's old enough to look after himself. Besides, if he's sensible and cooperates nicely, we won't harm a hair on his head. If not, we have ways of making him. Momo's lips were blue with cold. Making him do what? The voice sounded suddenly shrill and strained. We're tired of collecting people's time by the hour, minute, and second. We want all of it right away, and Horace got to hand it over. Horrified, Momo stared into the darkness beyond the ring of headlights. Well, what about the people it belongs to? She asked. What will happen to them? People? The voice rose to a scream and broke. People have been obsolete for years. They've made the world a place where there's no room left for their own kind. We shall rule the world. By now, the cold was so intense that Momo could barely move her lips, let alone speak. Never fear, though, little Momo, the voice went on. That naturally won't apply to you and your friends. You'll be the last and only people on Earth to play games and tell stories. As long as you stop meddling in our business, we'll leave you in peace. Is it a deal? The voice fell silent. A moment later, it took up the thread from a different quarter. You know we've told you the truth. We'll keep our promise. You can rely on that. Now, take us to Professor Hora. Momo tried to speak, almost fainting with cold. Finally, after several attempts, she said, Even if I could, I wouldn't. What do you mean, if you could? The voice said menacingly. Of course you can. You paid him a visit. You must know the way. I'd never find it again, Momo whispered. I've tried. Only Cassiopeia knows. Who's Cassiopeia? The professor's tortoise. Where's she now? Momo, barely conscious, murmured, She came back with me, but I lost her. And as if from a long way off, a chorus of agitated voices came to her ears. Issue a general alert, she heard. We've got to find that tortoise. Check every tortoise you come across. The animal's got to be found at all costs. The voices died away, and silence fell, and Momo slowly regained her senses. She was standing by herself in the middle of the square. Nothing was stirring but a chill gust of wind that seemed to issue from some great empty void, a wind as gray as ashes. Chapter 18, The Pursuit. Momo didn't know how much time had passed. The church clock chimed occasionally, but she scarcely heard it. Her frozen limbs took ages to thaw out. She felt numb and incapable of making decisions. How could she go home to the amphitheater and climb into bed knowing that there was no hope left for herself and her friends? How could she when she knew that things would never come right again? She was worried about Cassiopeia too. What if the men in gray found her? She began to reproach herself bitterly for having mentioned the tortoise at all, but she'd been too dazed to think straight. Anyway, she reflected, trying to console herself. Cassiopeia may have found her way back to Professor Aura long ago. Yeah, I hope she isn't looking for me. It would be better for both of us. And at that moment, something nudged her bare foot, and Momo gave a start and looked down. There was Cassiopeia, as large as life, and she could dimly see words on the animal's shell. Here I am again, they said. And without a second thought, Momo grabbed the tortoise and stuffed it under her jacket. And then she straightened up and peered in all directions, fearful that some men in gray might be lurking in the shadows. But all was quiet. Cassiopeia kicked and struggled fiercely in an effort to escape, and holding her tight, Momo peeped inside the jacket and whispered, Please keep still. Why all the fuss? Demanded Cassiopeia. You mustn't be seen, Momo hissed. The next words to appear on the tortoise's shell were, Aren't you glad? Of course, Momo said with a catch in her voice. Of course I am. You've no idea. And she kissed Cassiopeia on the nose several times in quick succession. Cassiopeia responded with two rather pink words. Steady on, they read. Momo smiled. Have you been looking for me all this time? Of course. But how did you happen to find me here and now? I knew I would, was the laconic reply. Had Cassiopeia spent all those weeks looking for her, although she knew she wouldn't find her? If so, she needn't really have bothered at all. This was yet another of Cassiopeia's little mysteries. They made Momo's head spin if she thought about them too hard, and besides, this was scarcely the moment to puzzle over such problems. Momo gave the tortoise a whispered account of what had happened since they last met. What should we do now? She concluded. Cassiopeia had been listening intently. Go to Hora. She spelled out, Now? Momo exclaimed aghast, but they're looking for you everywhere. This is the only place they don't happen to be. Wouldn't it be wiser to stay here? But all the tortoise's shell said was, We're going anyway. We'll run right into them, Momo protested. Won't meet a soul, was Cassiopeia's response. If Cassiopeia was sure, that settled it, and Momo put her down. And then, remembering their first long, arduous trek, she suddenly felt too exhausted to repeat it all over again. You go alone, Cassiopeia, she said wearily. I am too tired. Go on alone and give the professor my love. Cassiopeia's shell lit up again. It's not far. Momo was astonished to read. It dawned on her as she looked around that this shabby and desolate-looking neighborhood might be the one that led to the district with the white houses and the strange shadows. And if so, she might, after all, be able to make it as far as Never Lane and Nowhere House. All right, she said, I'll come too. But wouldn't it be quicker if I carried you? Afraid not, Cassiopeia replied. Why should you insist on crawling there by yourself? Momo said, but all she got was the enigmatic reply. The way's inside me.
And on that note, the tortoise set off with Momo following slowly, step by step. And they had only just disappeared down a side street when the shadows around the square came to life, and the air was filled with a brittle sound like the snapping of dry twigs. The men in gray were chuckling triumphantly. Some of their number who had stayed behind to keep a surreptitious watch on Momo had witnessed her reunion with Cassiopeia. The wait had been a long one, but not even they had dreamed that it would yield such results. "There they go," whispered one gray voice. "Shall we nab them?" "Of course not," hissed another. "Let them carry on." "Why?" demanded the first voice. "Our orders were to capture the tortoise at all costs." "Yes, but why do we want it?" "So it can lead us to Hora." "Precisely. That's just what it's doing now. We won't even have to use force. It's showing us the way of its own free will, unintentionally." Another dry chuckle went up from the shadows around the square. "Pass the words at once. Call off the search and instruct all agents to join us here. Tell them to exercise the utmost care, though. None of us must be seen by our two unsuspecting guides or get in their way. They are to be given free passage wherever they go. And now, gentlemen, let's follow at our leisure." It was hardly surprising under these circumstances that Momo and Cassiopeia failed to encounter a single one of their pursuers. Whichever way they went, the men in gray melted away in good time and joined the rear of the ever-growing procession that was silently, cautiously following in the fugitives' wake. Momo was wearier than she had been in her whole life. There were times when she thought she would simply sink into the ground and fall asleep at any moment. But she forced herself to put one foot before the other, and for a while things went better. If only Cassiopeia wouldn't crawl along at such a snail's pace, she thought. But it couldn't be helped, so she trudged along, looking neither right nor left, only at her feet and the tortoise. And after an eternity, or so it seemed to Momo, the surface of the street grew suddenly paler, and she wrenched her leaden eyelids open and looked around. Yes, they had finally reached the district where the light was neither that of dawn nor dusk, and where all the shadows ran in different directions. There were forbidding white houses with the cavernous black shadows, and there were the peculiar egg-like monument on its black stone plinth. At the thought that it wouldn't be long before she saw Professor Hora again, Momo's courage revived. "Please," she said to Cassiopeia, "couldn't we go a bit faster?" "More haste, less speed," came the reply, and the tortoise crawled on even more slowly than before. Yet Momo noticed, as she had the first time, that they made better progress that way, and it was as if the street beneath them glided past more quickly the slower they went. That, of course, was the secret of the district with the snow-white houses. The slower you went, the better progress you made, and the more you hurried, the slower your rate of advance. The men in gray hadn't known that when they pursued Momo in their cars, which is how she'd escaped them. But that was the last time. Things were quite different now that they had no intention of overtaking the girl and the tortoise. And now, because they were trailing them at exactly the same speed, they had discovered this secret. Gradually, the streets behind Momo and Cassiopeia became filled with an army of men in gray. And as the pursuers grew accustomed to the peculiarities of the district, they went even slower than their quarry. But the result was that they steadily overhauled them. It was like a race in reverse, a go-slow race. On and on the strange procession went, further and further into the dazzling white glow, weaving back and forth through the dream streets until it came to the corner of Never Lane. Cassiopeia turned into the lane and crawled towards Nowhere House, and Momo, remembering that she'd failed to make any headway until she had turned around and walked backwards, did the same again. And that's when her heart stood still. The time thieves, like a gray wall on the move, stretched away for as far as the eye could see, rank upon rank of them, filling the entire width of the street. Momo cried out in terror, but she couldn't hear her own voice. She walked backwards down Never Lane, staring wide-eyed at the advancing host of men in gray. But then another strange thing happened. As soon as the leaders tried to enter the lane, they vanished before her eyes. Their outstretched hands were the first to disappear, and then her legs and bodies, and at last of all their faces, which wore a look of surprise and horror. But Momo wasn't the only one to have witnessed this phenomenon. It had also been seen by the men in gray who were following behind.
and they shrank back, bracing themselves to resist the pressure of those advancing to the rear. And something of a scuffle ensued, and Momo saw her pursuers scowl and shake their fists, but they dared not pursue her any further. And at last she reached Nowhere House. The big bronze door swung open, and she darted inside, raced down the corridor lined with statues, opened the tiny door at the other end, ducked through it, ran across the great hall to the little room enclosed by the grandfather clocks, threw herself down on the dainty little sofa, and not wanting to see or hear anything more, buried her head under a cushion. 19. Under siege. A gentle voice was speaking. Momo emerged by degrees from the depths of a dreamless sleep, feeling wonderfully rested and refreshed. Momo isn't to blame, she heard the voice say, but you, Cassiopeia, you should have known better. Momo opened her eyes. Professor Hora was sitting at the little table in front of the sofa, looking ruefully down at the tortoise. Didn't it occur to you, he went on, that the men in gray might follow you? There wasn't room on Cassiopeia's shell for all she could say, so she had to reply in 3 installments. I can only see half an hour ahead. Too late by then. Professor Hora sighed and shook his head. Oh, Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia, even I find you puzzling sometimes. Ah, our guest is awake, Professor Hora said kindly. I hope you are feeling better. Much better, thank you, said Momo. Please excuse me for falling asleep on your sofa. The professor smiled. That's quite all right. You've no need to apologize. Cassiopeia has already brought me up to date on anything I failed to see through my omnivision glasses. What are the men in gray doing? Momo asked anxiously. Professor Hora produced a big blue handkerchief from his pocket. We are under siege. They have us completely surrounded. That is to say, they are as close to Nowhere House as they can get. But they can't get in, can they? The professor blew his nose. No, they can't. You saw for yourself. They vanish into thin air if they so much as set foot in Never Lane. Momo looked mystified. Yes, but I don't know why. Well, it's temporal suction that does it, the professor told her. Everything has to be done backwards in Never Lane, as you know, because time runs in reverse around this house. Normally, time flows into you, and the more time you have inside you, the older you get. But in Never Lane, time flows out of you. You grow younger while you were coming up the lane. Not much younger, only as much younger as the time you took to get from one end to the other. I didn't notice anything, Momo said, still mystified. Well, that's because you're a human being, the professor said with a smile, and there's a lot more to human beings than the name they carry around inside of them, but it's different with the men in gray. Stolen time is all they consist of, and that disappears in a flash when they're exposed to temporal desuction. It escapes like air from a burst balloon, the only difference being that a balloon skin survives, and in their case, there's nothing left at all. Momo knit her brow and thought hard. Well, wouldn't it be possible, she asked, to make time run backwards all over the world, if only for a little while? I mean, it wouldn't matter if people grew a tiny bit younger, but the time thieves would be reduced to nothing. The professor smiled again. A splendid idea, I grant you, but I'm afraid it wouldn't work. The two currents are in balance. You see, if you canceled one, the other would vanish too, and then there would be no time left. He broke off and pushed his omnivision glasses up so far that they rested on his forehead. On the other hand, he murmured. Momo watched him expectantly as he paced up and down the room a few times, lost in thought, and Cassiopeia followed him with her wise old eyes. At length, he sat down again. You've given me an idea, but I couldn't put it into practice unaided. He looked down at the tortoise. Cassiopeia, my dear, I'd like your opinion on something. What is the best thing to do when you're under siege? Have breakfast? Came the reply. Quite so. That is another splendid idea. The table was laid in a flash, and whether or not it had been laid at all this time, and Momo simply hadn't noticed, everything was in place. The 2 cups, the pot of steaming cocoa, the honey, butter, and crusty rolls. And Momo, whose mouth had often watered at the recollection of her first delicious golden-hued breakfast at Nowhere House, tucked in at once.
Everything tasted even better than before, if possible, and this time the professor tucked in heartily too. Professor, Momo said after a while, with her cheeks still bulging, they want you to give them all the time that exists. You won't do that, though, will you? No, child, he replied, that I'll never do. Time will come to an end someday, but not until people don't need it any longer. The men in gray won't get any time from me, not even a split second. But they say they can make you hand it over. Well, before we go into that, the professor told her very gravely, I'd like you to look at them for yourself. All she saw to begin with was a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes that made her so dizzy the first time, but it wasn't long before her eyes got used to the omnivision lenses, and then the besieging army swam into focus. The men in gray were drawn up in a long line, shoulder to shoulder, not only across the mouth of Never Lane, but all around the district with the snow white houses. And they formed an unbroken cordon, and at the midpoint of that cordon was Nowhere House. But then Momo noticed something else, something strange. Her first thought was that the lenses of the Omnivision glasses needed polishing, or that she hadn't quite grown used to them, but the outlines of the men in gray were looking misty. And she soon realized that this blurring had nothing to do with the lenses or her eyes. The mist was real, and it was rising from the streets all around, dense and impenetrable in some places, or just forming in others. The men in gray were standing absolutely still, all wearing bowlers and carrying briefcases, and all smoking little gray cigars, but the smoke from the cigars didn't disperse in the normal way. Here, where the air seemed to be made of glass and was never disturbed by a breath of wind, the threads of smoke clung like cobwebs, creeping along the streets and up the walls of the snow-white houses, festooning each ledge and cornice and windowsill, condensing into a noisome, bluish-green fog bank that billowed ever higher until it encircled Nowhere House like a wall. Momo took off the glasses and looked at Professor Hora inquiringly. Have you seen enough? He asked. Then let me have the glasses back, and he put them on again. You asked me if the men in gray could make me do something against my will. He went on. Well, they can't get at me personally, as you know, but they could subject the world to an evil far worse than any they've inflicted on it so far, and that is how they hope to force my hand. Momo was appalled. But what could be worse than stealing people's time? Well, I allot people their share of time, the professor explained. The men in gray can't stop that, but they can intercept the time that I distribute. But they can't intercept the time I distribute, but they can poison it. They can poison it? Momo repeated, more appalled still. The professor nodded. Yes, well, with the smoke from their cigars. Have you ever seen one without his little gray cigar? Of course not. That's because without it, they wouldn't exist. What kind of cigars are they? Momo asked. Well, do you remember where the hour lilies were growing? Professor Hora said. I told you then that everyone has a place like that because everyone has a heart. And if people allow the men in gray to gain a foothold there, more and more of their hour lilies get stolen. But hour lilies plucked from a person's heart can't die because they're never really withered, but they can't live either because they've been parted from their rightful owner. So they strive with every fiber of their being to return to the person they belong to. Momo was listening with bated breath. So if you think I know everything, Momo, you're wrong. And some evils are wrapped in mystery, and I've no idea where the men in gray keep their stolen hour lilies. I only know that they preserve the blossoms by freezing them until they're as hard as glass goblets. And then somewhere deep underground, there must be a gigantic cold store. Momo's cheeks began to burn with indignation. And that's where the men in gray draw their supplies from. They pull off the hour lily's petals, and then they let them wither till they're dried up and gray. And then they roll their little cigars out of them. And the petals still contain remnants of life even then. But living time is harmful to the men in gray. So they light the cigars and smoke them. And only when time has been converted into smoke is it well and truly dead. And that's what keeps the men in gray alive. Dead human time. Momo had risen to her feet. Oh, to think of all those poor flowers, all that dead time. Yes, the wall they're erecting around the house is built of dead time. There's still enough open sky above me to send people their time in good condition, but once that pall of smoke closes over our heads, every hour I send will be contaminated with the time thieves' poison, and when they absorb it, it will make them ill.
Momo stared at the professor uncomprehendingly. Well, what kind of illness is it? She asked in a low voice. A fatal illness. No, you scarcely notice it at first. I mean, one day you don't feel like doing anything. Nothing interests you, everything bores you. Far from wearing off, your boredom persists and gets worse. Day by day, week by week, you feel more and more bad-tempered, more and more empty inside, you more and more dissatisfied with yourself and the world in general, and then even that feeling wears off, and then you don't feel anything anymore, and you become completely indifferent to what goes on around you. Joy and sorrow, anger and excitement are things of the past. You forget how to laugh and cry. You're cold inside and incapable of loving anything or anyone. And once you reach that stage, the disease is incurable. There's no going back. You bustle around with a blank gray face, just like the men in gray themselves. Indeed, you've joined their ranks. The disease has a name. It's called deadly tedium. Momo shivered. You mean unless you hand over all the time there is, they'll turn people into creatures like themselves? Yes, that's how they hope to bully me into it. He rose and turned away. I've waited till now for people to get rid of those pests. They should have done it. After all, it was they who brought them into existence in the first place, but I can't wait any longer. I must do something, and I can't do it on my own. He looked at Momo in the eye. Will you help me? Well, yes, she whispered. If you do, you'll be running an incalculable risk. It will be up to you whether the world begins to live again or stand still forever and a day. Are you really prepared to take this risk? Yes, Momo repeated, and this time her voice was firm. In that case, said the professor, listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you because you'll be all on your own. I won't be able to help you, and nor will anyone else. I must begin by telling you that I never sleep, he said. If I dozed off, time would stand still and the world would come to a stop. And if there were no more time, the men in gray would have none of it left to steal, and they could continue to exist for a while by using up their reserves. But once those had gone, they would dissolve into thin air. Then the answer's simple, surely, said Momo. Not as simple as it sounds, I'm afraid, or I wouldn't need your help. The trouble is, if there were no more time, I couldn't wake up again. And if the world would continue to stand still for all eternity, it does, however, lie within my power to give you, and you alone, an hour lily. Only one, of course, because only one ever blooms at a time. So if time stopped all over the world, you would still have 1 hour's grace. And then I could wake you, said Momo. The professor shook his head. Well, that would achieve nothing because the men in gray have far too much time in reserve. They would consume very little of it in an hour, so they would still be here when the hour was up. No, Momo, the problem is a great deal harder than that. As soon as the men in gray notice that time has stopped, and it won't take them long because their supply of cigars will be interrupted, they will lift the siege and head for their secret store. Now, you must follow them and prevent them from reaching it. Now, when their cigars are finished, they'll be finished too. But then comes what may well turn out to be the hardest part of all. Once they reach the last of the time thieves has vanished, you must release every stolen minute because only when the people get their time back will I wake up and the world come to life again. And this you have to do within the space of a single hour. Now, Momo hadn't reckoned with such a host of difficulties and dangers. She stared at him helplessly. Will you try all the same? The professor asked. Is our only chance. Momo couldn't bring herself to speak, and she found the prospect so daunting. And at that moment, Cassiopeia's shell lit up. I'll come too, it signaled. Unlikely as it seemed that the tortoise could be of help, the words conjured up a tiny ray of hope, and Momo felt heartened at the thought of not being entirely alone. Although there were no rational grounds for such a feeling, it did at least enable her to make up her mind. I will try, she said resolutely. Professor Hora gave her a long look and started to smile. Many things will prove easier than you think. You've heard the music of the stars. You mustn't feel frightened. He turned to the tortoise. So, you want to go too, do you?
Of course, Cassiopeia spelled out. Then someone has to look out for her. The professor and Momo smiled at each other. Will she get an hour lily too? Momo asked. She doesn't need one, the professor replied, gently tickling the tortoise's neck. Cassiopeia is a creature from beyond the frontiers of time. She carries her own little supply of time inside her. She could go on crawling across the face of the earth even if everything else stood still forever. Good, said Momo, suddenly eager to get on with the job. Well, what happens next? Now, said the professor, we say goodbye. Momo felt a lump in her throat. Won't we ever see each other again? She asked softly. Of course we will, he told her. And until that day comes, every hour of your life will bring you my love. We will always be friends, won't we? And Momo nodded. I'm going now, the professor went on, but you mustn't follow me or ask where I'm going. My sleep is no ordinary sleep, and I'd sooner you weren't there. One last thing. As soon as I'm gone, you must open both doors, the little one with my name on it and the big bronze one that leads into Never Lane. And once time is stopped, everything will stand still, and no power on earth will be able to budge those doors. Have you understood and memorized all I've told you? Yes, said Momo, but how shall I know when time is stopped? You will know, never fear. They both stood up. Professor Hora gently stroked Momo's tousled mop of hair. Goodbye, Momo, he said, and thank you for listening so carefully. I'm going to tell everyone about you, she replied, when it's all over. And from one moment to the next, Professor Hora looked as old as he had when he carried her into the Golden Dome, as old as an ancient tree or primeval crag. Turning away, he walked swiftly out of the little room whose walls consisted of grandfather clocks, and Momo heard his footsteps fade until they were indistinguishable from the ticking of the countless clocks around her. Their incessant whirring and ticking and chiming seemed to have swallowed him up. Momo took Cassiopeia in her arms and held her tight. Her great adventure had begun. There could be no turning back. Chapter 20, Pursuing the Pursuers. Momo's first stop was to open the little door with Professor Hora's name on it. Then she sped along the corridor lined with statues and opened the big bronze front door. She had to exert all her strength because it was so heavy. And that done, she ran back to the great hall and waited, with Cassiopeia in her arms, to see what would happen. She didn't have to wait long. There was a sudden jolt, but it didn't actually shake the ground. It was a time quake, so to speak, not an earthquake. And no words could describe the sensation which accompanied by a sound of such as no human ear had ever heard before. A sigh that seemed to issue from the depths of the ages. And then it was over. Simultaneously, the innumerable clocks stopped ticking, whirring and chiming, and pendulums came to a sudden halt and stayed put at odd angles, and the silence that fell was more profound than any that had ever reigned before. Time itself was standing still. And for Momo, she became aware that she was clasping the stem of an hour lily of exceptional size and beauty. She hadn't felt anyone put it into her hand. It simply appeared as if it had always been there. And gingerly, Momo took a step, and surely enough, she could move as easily as ever. The remains of breakfast were still on the table, and she sat down at one of the little armchairs, but the seat was as hard as marble and didn't yield an inch. And then there was a mouthful of chocolate left in her cup, but the cup wouldn't move either. She tried dipping her fingers in the dregs, but they were as hard as butterscotch, and so was the honey, and even the crumbs were stuck fast to the plates. Now that time had stopped, everything else was immovable too. Cassiopeia had started to fidget. Looking down, Momo saw something on her shell. You're wasting time, she read. Heavens alive, and so she was. So Momo pulled herself together. She hurried through the forest of clocks to the little door and squeezed through it and ran along the passage to the front door, and she peered out and then darted back in a panic. Her heart began to thump furiously. Far from running away, the time thieves were streaming towards her, up Never Lane. They could do that, of course, now that time had ceased to flow in reverse, but she hadn't allowed for that possibility. She raced back to the great hall and, still clutching Cassiopeia, hid behind a massive grandfather clock. That's a good start, she murmured ruefully, and then she heard the men in gray come marching along the corridor. They squeezed through the little door, one after another, until the whole crowd of them assembled inside. "So this is our new headquarters," said one, surveying the vast room. "Very impressive." "That girl let us in," said another gray voice. "I distinctly saw her open the door, that sensible child. I wonder how she managed to get around the old man." "If you ask me, the old man's knuckled under. If time has stopped flowing in Never Lane, it can only mean he's switched it off himself. In other words, he knows he's beaten. But where is he, the old man mischief maker? Let's finish him off." The men in gray were looking around when one of them had a sudden thought. His voice sounded even grayer, as if possible than the rest. "Something's wrong, gentlemen," he said. "The clocks. Look at the clocks. Every one of them has stopped. Even this hourglass here." "I suppose he must have stopped them," the voice said uncertainly. "Well, you can't stop an hourglass," the first man retorted. "See it for yourselves, gentlemen. The sand's suspended in mid-air, and the hourglass itself won't budge. What does it mean?" He was still speaking when the footsteps came pounding along the corridor, and yet another man in gray squeezed through the little door, gesticulating wildly. "We've just had word from our agents in the city," he announced. "Their cars have stopped, and so is everything else. The world's at a standstill. There isn't a microsecond of time to be had anywhere. Our supplies have been cut off. Time has ceased to exist, or has shut it off." There was a deathly hush, and then someone said, "Do you mean switched it off? What'll become of us when we finish the cigars we're smoking?" "What'll become of us? You know that perfectly well. This is disastrous, gentlemen." They all began to shout at once. "Hora is planning to destroy us. We must lift the siege at once. We must try to reach the time store. Without our cars, we'll never make it in time. My cigar won't last me more than 27 minutes. Mine will last me 48. Give it to me then. Are you crazy? It's every man for himself." There was a concerted rush for the little door, and from her hiding place, Momo saw panic-stricken gray figures trying to squeeze through it, jostling, scuffling, and swapping punches in a desperate attempt to save their gray lives. The rush became a violent melee as they knocked each other's hats off, wrestling each other, snatching cigars from each other's mouths, and whenever they lost their cigars, they seemed to lose every ounce of strength as well. They stood there with their outstretched arms and a plaintive, terrified expression on their faces, growing more and more transparent until they finally vanished. Nothing remained of them, not even their hats. In the end, only 3 men in gray were left, and they ducked through the little door, one after the other, and scuttled off down the passage. Momo, with Cassiopeia under one arm and her free hand tightly clutching the hour lily, ran after them. All now depended on her keeping them in sight. She saw when she emerged from the front door that they had already reached the mouth of Never Lane. More smoke-wreathed men in gray were standing there talking and gesticulating excitedly. As soon as they caught sight of the 3 fugitives from Nowhere House, they started running too. Others joined in the stampede, and soon the whole army had taken to its heels. More haste, less speed no longer applied, of course, now that time was at a standstill. An endless column of gray figures streamed towards the city, through the strange, dreamlike district, its snow-white houses and oddly assorted shadows, past the monument resembling an egg, until it came to the gray, shabby tenements inhabited by people who lived on the edge of time. Here, too, though, everything was still and silent. What followed was a chase in reverse, a chase in which countless gray figures were pursued through the city at a discreet distance behind the last of the stragglers by a girl with a flower in her hand and a tortoise under her arm. But how strange the city looked now. Long lines of cars choked the streets with the fumes from their exhausts solidified, and behind each wheel sat a motionless driver, one hand frozen on the horn or gear lever. Momo even caught sight of one driver who had been immobilized while glaring at his neighbor and meaningfully tapping his forehead. Cyclists were poised at road junctions with their arms extended, signaling right or left, and the people thronging the pavements resembled waxworks figures. Traffic policemen stood at crossroads, whistles in their mouths, caught in the act of waving the traffic on. A flock of pigeons hovered motionless above a square, and in high overhead, as though painted on the sky, was an equally motionless aeroplane. The water in the fountains might have been ice. Leaves falling from trees were suspended in air, and one little dog, which was cocking its leg against a lamppost, looked as if it had been stuffed that way. Lifeless as a photograph, the city rang to the hurrying footsteps of the men in gray. Momo followed them cautiously, fearful of being spotted.
But she needn't have worried. Their headlong flight was proving so arduous and exhausting that they had ceased to notice anything more. Unaccustomed to running so far and fast, they panted and gasped for breath, grimly clutching their teeth on little gray cigars that kept them in existence. More than one of them let his cigar fall while running and vanished into thin air before he could retrieve it. But their companions in misfortune represented an even greater threat. Such was the desperation of those whose own cigars were almost finished that many of them snatched the butts from their neighbors' mouths so that their numbers slowly but steadily dwindled. Those who still had a small store of cigars in their briefcases were careful to conceal them from the others because the have-nots kept hurling themselves at the haves and trying to wrest their precious possessions from them. Scores of struggling figures engaged in ferocious tussles, scrabbling and clawing with such wild abandon that most of the coveted cigars spilled onto the road and were trampled underfoot. The men in gray had become so frightened of extinction that they completely lost their heads. There was something else that caused them increasing difficulties the further into town they got. The streets were so crowded that at many points, it was all they could do to thread their way through the forest of motionless pedestrians. Momo, being small and thin, had an easier time of it, but even she had to watch her step. You could hurt yourself badly on a feather suspended in midair if you ran into it by mistake. On and on they went, and Momo still had no idea how much further it was to the time store. She peered anxiously at her hour lily, but it had only just come into full flower. There was no need to worry just yet. And then something happened that temporarily drove every other thought from her mind. Glancing down a side street, she caught sight of Beppo. Beppo, she called, beside herself with joy as she ran toward him. I've been looking for you everywhere. Where have you been? Why did you never come see me? Oh, Beppo, Beppo, dearest Beppo. And still clutching Cassiopeia, she flung her free arm around his neck and promptly bounced off because he might have been made of cast iron. It was such a painful collision that tears sprang to her eyes, and she sprang back sobbing and gazed at him. The little old man looked backed than ever, and his kindly face was thin and gaunt and very pale, and his chin was frosted with white stubble because he so seldom found the time to shave nowadays. Incessant sweeping had worn away his broom until the bristles were little longer than his beard. And there stood, as motionless as everyone and everything else, staring down at the dirty street through his steel-rimmed spectacles. Momo had found him at last, but only now when she couldn't get him to notice her, and it might be very well the last time she saw him. If things went wrong, old Beppo would continue to stand there forevermore. Cassiopeia started fidgeting again. Keep going, she spelled out. And Momo dashed to the back street and stopped dead, and there were no men in gray to be seen. And she ran on a little way, but it was no use. She'd lost track of them, and she halted again, wondering what to do, and looked inquiringly at Cassiopeia. Keep going, the tortoise signaled again. You'll find them. And if Cassiopeia knew in advance that she would find the time thieves, she would find them whichever way she went. Any direction was bound to be the right one, and so she simply ran on, turning left or right as the fancy took her. And she had now reached the housing development on the city's northern outskirts, where the buildings were as alike as peas in a pod, and the streets ran dead straight from horizon to horizon. On and on she ran, but the sheer sameness of the buildings and the streets soon made her feel as if she were running on the spot and getting nowhere. The housing development was a veritable maze, but a maze that deceived one by its regularity and uniformity. Momo had almost lost hope when she caught sight of a man in gray disappearing around a corner. He was limping along with his suit in tatters and his bowler hat and briefcase gone, his mouth grimly pursed around the smoldering butt of a little gray cigar. She followed him along a street flanked by endless rows of houses until they came to a gap. The big rectangular site where the missing house should have stood was boarded up, and set in the fence was a gate, and the gate was a little ajar, and the last gray straggler squeezed quickly through it. And there was a notice above the gate, and Momo paused to read. Danger, keep out. No unauthorized persons admitted. Chapter 21, an end and a beginning. Momo took several seconds to decipher the longer words on the notice board, and by the time she slipped through the gate, the last of the men in gray had disappeared. In front of her yawned a gigantic pit, 80 or 90 feet deep, with bulldozers and excavators around it. Several trucks had stopped midway down the ramp that led to the bottom of the pit, and construction workers were standing motionless all over the place, frozen in a variety of poses. Where to now? There was no sign of the man in gray and no clue as to where he might have gone. Cassiopeia seemed equally at a loss. Her shell did not light up. Momo made her way down the ramp to the bottom of the pit and looked around, and suddenly she saw a familiar face. It was Salvatore, the bricklayer who had painted the pretty flower picture on the wall of her room. He was as motionless as all the rest, but something about his pose made Momo think twice. He was cupping his mouth as though calling to someone, pointing to the rim of a huge pipe jutting down from the ground beside him, almost as if drawing Momo's attention to it. And Momo wasted no time. Taking this as a good omen, she hurried over to the pipe and climbed inside. She lost her footing almost at once because the pipe sloped downwards at a steep angle, twisting and turning so sharply that she slithered back and forth like a child on a helter-skelter. She could see and hear almost nothing as she hurtled ever deeper into the ground, sometimes sliding on her bottom, sometimes rolling head over heels, but never letting go of the tortoise and the hour lily. The deeper she went, the colder it became, and she began to wonder how she would ever get out again. But before she could give the problem any real thought, the pipe abruptly ended in an underground passage. It wasn't as dark here. The tunnel was bathed in a gray twilight that seemed to ooze from its very walls. Momo scrambled up and ran on. Her bare feet made no sound, but she could hear footsteps ahead of her. Guessing that they belonged to the men in gray, she allowed herself to be guided by them. To judge by the innumerable passages leading off her own in all directions, she was in a maze of tunnels that ran the full extent of the housing development. And then she heard a babble of voices. Having traced the hubbub to its source, she cautiously peeped around the corner. She found herself looking at a room as vast as the conference table that ran down the middle of it, and at this table in 2 long rows sat the surviving men in gray. Momo almost felt sorry for them. They looked so woebegone. Their suits were worn, their bald heads cut and bruised, and their faces convulsed with fear, but their cigars were still smoldering. Embedded in the wall at one far end of the room, Momo saw a huge steel door. The door was ajar, and an icy draft was streaming from whatever lay beyond. And although Momo knew it would do little good, she burrowed down and tucked her bare feet under her skirt. A man in gray was presiding at the head of the conference table just in front of the strong room door. "We must economize," Momo heard him say. "Our reserves must be carefully husbanded. After all, we don't know how long they'll have to last us." "There's only a handful of us left," cried someone. "They'll last us for years." "The sooner we start economizing," the chairman went on imperturbably, "the longer we'll hold out. I don't have to tell you, gentlemen, what I mean by economizing. It will be quite sufficient if only some of us survive this disaster. Let's face facts. As things stand now, there are far too many of us. Common sense dictates that our ranks be drastically thinned. May I ask you to call out numbers in turn?" When the men in gray had called out numbers all round the table, the chairman produced a coin from his pocket. "I shall now toss up. Heads means the even numbers survive, tails the odd numbers." He flipped the coin and caught it. "Heads. Even numbers may remain seated. Odd numbers are requested to dissolve forthwith." The losers emitted a dull groan, but none of them demurred, and as soon as the winners had relieved them of their cigars, they vanished into thin air. The chairman's voice broke the hush. "And now, gentlemen, kindly do the same again." The same gruesome procedure was followed a second time, and then a third and a fourth, until only a half-dozen men in gray remained. They sat at the head of the conference table, 3 to a side, and glared at each other in icy silence. Momo, who had watched these developments with horrified fascination, noticed that the temperature rose appreciably every time another batch of losers disappeared. Comparable to what had been before, the cold was quite tolerable. "6, remarked one of the survivors, "is an unlucky number." "That's enough," said another. "There's no point in reducing our numbers still further. If 6 of us can't survive this disaster, neither will 3. Not necessarily, said someone else, but we can always review the situation if the need arises. Later, I mean. No one spoke for a while, and then another survivor said, "Lucky for us, the door to time was open when disaster struck. If it had been shut at the crucial moment, no power on earth could open it now, and we would be absolutely sunk." "You're not entirely right, I'm afraid," replied another. "Because the door is open, cold is escaping from the refrigeration plant. The hour lilies will slowly thaw out, and you all know what will happen then. We won't be able to prevent them from returning to their original owners." "You mean," said the others, "that our own coldness won't be sufficient to keep them deep frozen?" "There are only 6 of us, unfortunately," said the second speaker. "You can calculate our freezing capability for yourself. Personally, I feel it was rather rash to cut down our numbers so drastically. It hasn't paid off." "Well, we had to opt for one course of action or the other," snapped the first speaker, "and we did, so that's that." Another silence fell. "In other words," said someone, "we may have to sit here for years on end, twiddling our thumbs and gawping at each other. I found that a dismal prospect, I must confess." Momo racked her brains. There was certainly no point in her sitting there waiting any longer. When the men in gray were gone, the hour lilies would thaw out by themselves. But the men in gray still existed and would continue to exist unless she did something about it. But what could she do, given that the door to the cold store was open and the time thieves could help themselves to fresh supplies whenever they wanted? At this moment, Cornucopia nudged her in the ribs. Momo looked down and saw the message on her shell. "Shut the door." "I can't," she whispered. "I'll never move it." "Use the flower." "You mean I could use it if I touched it with the hour lily?" whispered Momo. "Yes, and you will," the tortoise spelled out. If Cassiopeia knew this in advance, it had to be true. So Momo carefully put the tortoise down, and then she took the hour lily, which was wilting by now and had lost most of its petals, and stowed it inside her jacket. Going down on all fours, she sneaked unseen beneath the conference table and crawled to the far end. And by the time she was on a level with the time thieves' 6 pairs of legs, her heart was pounding fit to burst. And very, very gingerly, she took out the hour lily and, gripping the stem between her teeth, crawled on. And still unobserved by the men in gray, she reached the open door and touched it with the hour lily and simultaneously gave it a push. And the well-oiled hinges didn't make a sound. The door swung silently to, and then shut with a mighty clang that went echoing around the conference chamber and reverberated from the walls of innumerable underground passages. Momo jumped to her feet. The men in gray, who hadn't the remotest idea that anyone but themselves was exempt from the universal standstill, sat rooted to their chairs in horror, staring at her. And without a second thought, she dashed past them and sprinted to the exit. The men in gray recovered from their shock and raced after her. "It's that frightful girl!" she heard one of them shout. "It's Momo!" "Impossible! The creature's moving! She's got an hour lily," bellowed a third. "Is that how she moved the door?" The fifth smote his brow. "Then we could have moved it ourselves. We've got plenty of hour lilies." "We did have, you mean," screamed the sixth. "Only one thing can save us now that the door's shut. If we don't get hold of that flower of hers, we're done for." Meanwhile, Momo had already disappeared into the maze of tunnels. The men in gray knew their way around better, of course, but she just managed to elude them by zigzagging to and fro. Cassiopeia played her own special part in the chase. Although she could only crawl, she always knew in advance where Momo's pursuers would go next, and she got there in good time and stationed herself in their path. And the men in gray tripped over her and went sprawling, and the ones behind tripped over them and went sprawling, with the result that she more than once saved Momo from almost certain capture. Although she herself was often sent hurling against walls by flying feet, nothing could deter her from continuing to do what she knew in advance she would do. And as the chase proceeded, several of the pursuing men in gray became so maddened by their craving for the hour lily that they dropped their cigars and vanished into thin air, one after the other, and in the end, only 2 were left. Momo doubled back and took refuge in the conference chamber. The 2 surviving time thieves chased her around the table, but failed to catch her, and so they split up and ran in a corner and gazed at her pursuers in terror, with the hour lily clasped to her chest, and all but 3 of its shimmering petals had withered and fallen. The foremost man in gray was just about to snatch the flower when the other one yanked him away. "No!" he shrieked.
That flower's mine, mine, I tell you. And they grappled with each other. And in the ensuing scrimmage, the first man knocked the second man's cigar out of his mouth. And with a weird groan, the second man spun around, went transparent, and vanished. The last of the men in gray advanced on Momo with a minuscule cigar butt smoldering in the corner of his mouth. "Get here!" he gasped. But as he did so, the butt fell out of his mouth and rolled under the table, and he flung himself to the ground and groped for it, but it eluded his outstretched fingers. And turning his ashen face towards Momo, he struggled into a sitting position and raised one trembling hand. "Please," he whispered, "please, dear child, give me the flower." And Momo, still cowering in her corner, couldn't get a word out. She clasped the flower still tighter and shook her head. And the last of the men in gray slowly said, "I'm glad," he murmured. "I'm glad it's all over." And then he vanished too. And Momo was staring dazedly at the places he had been when Cassiopeia crawled into view. "You'll open the door," Herschel announced. And Momo went over to the door, touched it with her hour lily, which had only one last petal left, and opened it wide. And the time store was cold no longer, now that the last of all the time thieves had gone. And Momo marveled at the contents of the huge vault. Innumerable hour lilies were arrayed on endless shelves like crystal goblets, no two alike, and each more beautiful than the other. Hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of hours were stored there, all of them stolen from people's lives. And the temperature steadily rose until the vault was as hot as a greenhouse. And just as the last petal of Momo's hour lily fluttered to the ground, all the other flowers left their shelves in clouds and swirled around her head. It was like a warm spring storm, but a storm made up of time released from captivity. And as if in a dream, Momo looked around and saw Cassiopeia on the ground beside her. The glowing letters on her shell read, "Fly home, Momo, fly home." And that was the last Momo ever saw of Cassiopeia, because the tempest of flowers rose to an indescribable pitch, and as it gained strength, so Momo was lifted off her feet and borne away like a flower herself, along the dark passages, out into the open air, and high above the city, soaring over the roofs in a cloud of flowers that grew bigger every moment. She was wafted up and down and around like someone performing a triumphal dance to glorious music. And then the cloud of flowers drifted slowly, lazily down and landed like snowflakes on the frozen faces of the earth. And like snowflakes, they gently dissolved and became invisible as they returned to their true home in the hearts of mankind. And in that same moment, time began again. And everything awoke to new life. And the cars drove on, and the traffic police blew their whistles. The pigeons continued circling. And the little dog made a puddle against the lamppost. Nobody noticed that time had stood still for an hour because nothing had moved in the interval. It was all over in the twinkling of an eye. Nothing had moved. No. But something had changed. All of a sudden, people found that they had plenty of time to spare. They were delighted, naturally, but they never realized that it was their own time that had miraculously been restored to them. And when Momo came to her senses again, she found herself back in the side street where she had last seen Beppo. And sure enough, there he was, leaning on his broom with his back to her, gaze ruminating into the distance as he used to in the old days. He wasn't in a hurry anymore. And for some unknown reason, he felt brighter and more hopeful. I wonder, he thought, maybe I've already saved 100,000 hours I need to ransom Momo. And at that moment, someone tugged at his jacket, and he turned to see Momo smiling up at him, large as life. There are no words to describe the joy of that reunion. Beppo and Momo laughed and cried by turns, and they both kept talking at once, talking all kinds of nonsense too, as people do when they're dazed with delight, and they hugged each other again and again. and passengers paused to share in their happiness, their tears, and their laughter, because they all had plenty of time to spare. At long last, Beppo shouldered his broom. He took the rest of the day off, of course, and the two of them strolled arm in arm through the city to the old amphitheater, still talking 19 to the dozen. And it was a long time since the city has witnessed such scenes. Children played in the middle of the street, getting in the way of cars whose drivers had not only watched and waited, smiling broadly, but sometimes got out and joined in the games. And people stood about chatting with the friendliness of those who take a genuine interest in their neighbor's welfare. Other people on their way to work had time to stop and admire the flowers in a window box or feed the birds. And doctors, too, had time to devote themselves properly to their patients, and their workers of all kinds did their jobs with pride and loving care now that they were no longer expected to turn out as much work as possible in the shortest possible time. They could take as much time as they needed and wanted, because from now on, there was enough time for everyone. And many people never discovered whom they had to thank for all of this, just as they never knew what had actually happened during the hour that had passed in a flash. Few of them would have believed the story anyway. The only ones that knew and believed it were Momo's friends. But by the time Momo and Beppo reached the amphitheater, they were all there waiting. Guido, Paolo, Massimo, Franco, Maria, and her little sister Rosa, and Claudio, and a host of other children, and Nino, the innkeeper, and his plump wife, Liliana, and their baby, and Salvatore, the bricklayer, and all of Momo's regular visitors in the days gone by. The celebration that followed, which was as merry and joyous as only Momo's friends could have made it, went on till the stars came out. And then when all the cheers and hugs and handshakes and excited chatter had subsided, everyone sat down on the grass-grown steps. And a great hush fell as Momo stepped out onto a middle of the arena, and she thought of the music of the stars and the hour lilies. And then in a sweet, pure voice, she began to sing. And meanwhile, in Nowhere House, the return of time had roused Professor Hora from his first sleep ever. Still very pale, he looked as if he had just recovered from a serious illness, but his eyes sparkled, and there was a smile on his lips as he watched Momo and her friends through his omnivision glasses. And then he felt something touch his foot. And taking off his glasses, he looked down and saw Cassiopeia sitting there. Cassiopeia, he said, tickling her affectionately under the chin, the two of you did a fine job. I couldn't watch you for once, so you must tell me all about it. Later, the tortoise signaled, and then she sneezed. The professor looked concerned. You haven't caught a cold, have you? You bet I have, replied Cassiopeia. You must have gone too close to the men in gray, said the professor. I expect you are very tired too. We can talk later. Better go off and have a good sleep first. Thanks, came the answer. And Cassiopeia limped off and picked herself a nice, dark, quiet corner. And she tucked her head and legs in, and very slowly, in letters visible only to those who have read this story, her shell spelled out 2 words: the end. And now there's a 1-page author's postscript that I will read. Of course, the author is Michael Ende. And I just want to remind myself when this was. Got these old eyes. When the copyright is 1973 in Germany. So it would have been 5. Many of my readers may have questions they'd like to ask, and if so, I'm afraid I can't help them. The fact is, I wrote the story down from memory just as it was told to me, And I never met Momo or any of her friends, nor do I know what became of them or how they are today. And as for the city where they lived, I can only guess which one it is. The most I can tell you is this. One night in a train while I was on a long journey, as I still am, I found myself sitting opposite a remarkable fellow passenger. Remarkable in that I found it quite impossible to tell his age. At first, I put him down as an old man, but then I soon saw I must have been mistaken because suddenly he seemed very young. Though that impression too soon proved false. And at any rate, it was he who told me the story during our long night together. And neither of us spoke for some moments after he had finished. And then my mysterious acquaintance made a remark which I feel bound to put on the record. Quote, I've described all of these events, he said, as if they had already happened. I might just as well have described them as if they still lay in the future. To me, there is very little difference. He must have left the train at the next station because I noticed after a while that I was alone. As I've never bumped into him again, unfortunately, if by any chance I do, though I shall have plenty of questions to ask him myself. So that is the end of Momo. Apologies for the months long delay. A lot has happened. Thank you for joining me on this Christmas Eve night. I wasn't really sure how I would spend it. Yeah, yesterday was hard, but this makes me feel hopeful. And to all the people out there who are feeling lonely and who are trying to explain about the little gray men and their time bank, time thievery, and who feel like you're not getting through. I think that this is a story to remind us that time isn't what we think it is. And love is key, and friendship is key. And even though many may be enchanted by wrong-thinkingness, techno-mediated wrong-thinkingness, our hearts are there, right? Our hearts are with the people that we love, even if they might not be able to know or see it. There's an energy that can't be stopped. The little gray man can't stop that. So, I miss you, Dad. To all who celebrate, Merry Christmas. And thanks for being here. Good night, everybody.